Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight, we're going to be talking about one of the most remarkable stories of human history. It's a story of incredible resilience, of grit and ingenuity on a scale that's almost impossible for us to imagine. We're going to journey back in time, all the way back to the last great ice age, to follow the footsteps of the very first people to enter the Americas. This isn't a story of a single, simple journey. It's a saga that spans thousands of years, across a lost continent, in a world dominated by giants of ice and flesh. It's the story of how a small group of hunters, living on the edge of the world, went on to populate two entire continents. It's an epic, and like all the best epics, it's also a deeply human story. As always, if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, a simple like, a subscribe, or a comment is always so deeply appreciated. It lets me know that these quiet stories are finding a home, and on that note, I'm always so curious to know where you all are listening from. It's a lovely thought, all of us scattered around the globe, settling in for the night together, so feel free to leave a comment saying where you're from. But for now, that's all the housekeeping. It's time to settle in, find that perfect spot, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, let go of the day, and let's ease into our journey together, back to a world that is, in every sense of the word, long, long gone. Chapter 1. The World Before the Crossing. Our story doesn't begin with a single step onto a new continent. It begins much, much earlier, in a world that would be almost unrecognizable to us. To understand the journey, we first have to understand the world that made the journey possible. We have to understand the stage upon which this incredible human drama was set, and that stage was the late Pleistocene epoch, a time more commonly, and perhaps more dramatically, known as the Ice Age. Now, when we hear the term Ice Age, our modern minds tend to conjure up cartoonish images of talking sloths and bumbling saber-toothed squirrels, but the reality was a far more profound and alien state for our planet. For tens of thousands of years, the Earth was in the grip of a deep, relentless cold. This wasn't just a series of very bad winters. The thermostat of the world hadn't just been turned down, it felt like the dial had been broken off entirely. The most obvious feature of this world was the ice itself, vast continental-scale ice sheets that were, for all intents and purposes, the story's main antagonist. We're not talking about a quaint mountain glacier you might see on a postcard. We are talking about sheets of ice so immense, so heavy, that they warped the very crust of the Earth beneath them. The Laurentide ice sheet, for instance, blanketed almost all of what is now Canada and a significant chunk of the northern United States. In places, it was over 2 miles thick. Think about that for a moment. 2 miles of solid ice pressing down. It was a creeping, grinding, seemingly unstoppable force of nature that devoured mountains, carved out valleys, and held a terrifying amount of the world's water hostage. And that is the key. That's the detail that changes the entire map of the world. All of that water, trillions upon trillions of gallons, had to come from somewhere. And it came from the oceans. As the glaciers grew, the global sea level plummeted. Not by a few feet, but by as much as 400 feet, or about 120 meters. This was a planet with a different coastline, a radically different one. Islands we know today were connected to the mainland. Familiar coastlines were miles inland from where the waves actually broke. It was a world where you could, in theory, walk from mainland Australia to Tasmania, or from Britain to France. The world's geography was a rough draft of what we know today. And this epic drawdown of the oceans is what created the setting for our story. It revealed a piece of land that is now submerged beneath the waves, a lost world that served as the gateway to the Americas. We call it Beringia. The name we often learn in school is the Bering Land Bridge, but that phrase is wonderfully, almost comically, inadequate. It conjures up an image of a narrow, icy causeway, a sort of precarious highway stretching from Asia to America, with people scurrying across it as fast as they can. The reality was so much grander. Beringia wasn't a bridge, it was a subcontinent. At its greatest extent, it was a vast expanse of land stretching nearly 1,000 miles from north to south. It was a place, a destination in its own right, a homeland. It connected what is now modern-day Siberia with modern-day Alaska, but it was so much more than just a connector. It was a world of its own, with its own climate, its own ecosystems, and for a very long time its own human population. To understand the people who would eventually cross into the Americas, we have to understand where they came from first. Their crucible was not Beringia itself, but the lands to the west, in the vast, unforgiving expanse of northeastern Siberia. This was the heart of a biome that no longer exists on Earth, a place scientists call the Mammoth Steppe. The Mammoth Steppe was the single largest ecosystem on the planet during the Ice Age. It stretched almost unbroken from Spain, across the whole of northern Eurasia, through Beringia, and into parts of North America. But when you hear the word steppe, you might think of the grassy plains of Central Asia, and when you hear Siberia, you probably think of dense, snowy taiga forest. The Mammoth Steppe was neither of these things. It was a world defined by two simple, powerful words: cold and dry. It was so cold that the immense ice sheets to the west and east couldn't form here. There simply wasn't enough moisture in the air to create the kind of snowfall needed to build glaciers 2 miles high. The air was bone dry, more like the Gobi Desert than a frozen wasteland. This dryness meant that even in the depths of the Ice Age, the ground wasn't buried under a thick, insulating blanket of snow for most of the year. The winter sun, though low and weak, could still reach the ground, and this created a paradox. This intensely cold, dry environment wasn't a barren, frozen desert. It was, instead, a sprawling, windswept grassland, a cold-adapted prairie. The ground was frozen solid year-round, a condition we call permafrost, which meant that deep-rooted trees couldn't survive, but the surface layer would thaw in the brief, intense summer, allowing a carpet of highly nutritious grasses, herbs, and wildflowers to flourish. It was a landscape of subtle, muted colors, endless plains of pale gold and silvery green, stretching to a horizon that seemed 1,000,000 miles away. The sky was vast and often clear, the air thin and sharp in your lungs. The defining feature was the wind, a constant scouring wind that blew unimpeded across the plains, picking up fine glacial dust called loess and depositing it across the land, constantly enriching the soil. It sounds bleak, and in many ways it was. The winters were brutally long and dark, with temperatures that would make modern Arctic winters seem balmy. We're talking about sustained periods of 50, 60, even 70 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. At these temperatures, your breath freezes instantly into a cloud of ice crystals. Exposed skin would freeze in seconds, metal becomes brittle, and shatters like glass. It was a cold that was not just a sensation, but an active, malevolent presence that sought out every crack in your clothing, every gap in your shelter. Forget about arguments over the thermostat. The main goal was simply not to wake up as a permanent part of the room's ice sculpture collection. And yet, this harsh, windswept world was teeming with life. It was, in a sense, the Serengeti of the Ice Age. The nutrient-rich grasses and herbs supported vast herds of enormous grazing animals, the likes of which our world will never see again. This was the kingdom of the megafauna. The headline act, of course, was the creature that gave the biome its name, the woolly mammoth, Mammothus primigenius. These weren't just big, hairy elephants. They were masterpieces of Ice Age engineering. Standing up to 11 feet tall at the shoulder, a large male could weigh over 6 tons. They were covered in a dense, woolly undercoat for insulation, and then a long, shaggy outer coat of guard hairs, some up to 3 feet long, that acted like a protective curtain against the wind and snow. They had a thick layer of fat, up to 3 inches thick, for even more insulation. Their ears were tiny compared to a modern elephant's, minimizing heat loss. Even their blood was special, with a type of hemoglobin that was resistant to cold, allowing them to keep oxygen flowing to their extremities. They were walking mountains, moving fortresses of flesh and bone, perfectly designed for this world. And their tusks were magnificent, curving out and then back in. A large male's tusks could grow to be over 16 feet long. They weren't just for show, or for fighting off rivals. They were tools. They used them to sweep away snow to get at the buried grasses beneath, to break ice to get a drink, and to defend themselves and their young from the terrifying predators that shared their world. Watching a herd of mammoths move across the steppe must have been one of the great sights in the history of life on Earth. The ground would have trembled, the air would have been filled with their low, rumbling communications, calls that were so deep they were probably felt as much as they were heard. Alongside the mammoths were incredible herds of steppe bison, much larger, and with more formidable horns than their modern American cousins. There were herds of wild horses, not the sleek, graceful animals we know, but tough, shaggy, cold-adapted equines. There were woolly rhinoceroses, solitary, grumpy tanks of an animal, with a massive horn on their snout made of compacted hair, looking like something straight out of a fantasy novel. Reindeer, Saiga antelope, musk oxen. The plains were a movable feast, a constant source of protein and fat for anything clever enough to hunt them. And where there are vast herds of herbivores, there are, inevitably, predators. And the predators of the Mammoth Steppe were just as impressive as their prey. The top of the food chain was occupied by the cave lion. Again, the name is a bit of a misnomer. They didn't exclusively live in caves, and they were not quite lions as we know them. They were about 25% larger than a modern African lion, with longer legs built for running across open ground. They were probably maneless, more like a giant, powerfully built lioness. They were ambush and pursuit predators, working together to bring down bison, horses, and even young mammoths. A pride of cave lions on the hunt would have been a spectacle of terrifying power and efficiency. There were also packs of giant steppe wolves, larger and more robust than modern grey wolves, and hyenas adapted for cracking the massive bones left behind by other predators. But perhaps the most fearsome predator of all, the one that probably haunted the nightmares of every human on the steppe, was the short-faced bear, Arctodus simus. This was a bear on an entirely different scale. Standing on its hind legs, it could reach a height of 12 feet. It had long, powerful legs, built not for lumbering, but for running. It wasn't just a scavenger. It was an active and terrifyingly fast predator, capable of chasing down horses. It was the largest mammalian land predator of its time, and a chance encounter with one on the open plain would have been a death sentence. This was the world, a world of immense, soul-crushing cold, of relentless wind, and of giant, mythic beasts. And into this world, we place a small, unassuming, bipedal ape, us, Homo sapiens. The people who lived on the Mammoth Steppe were the product of a brutal, millennia-long filtering process. This was not an environment you could just wander into unprepared. To survive here required a level of knowledge, skill, and sheer toughness that is difficult for us, in our centrally heated homes, to even comprehend. These were the ancestors of the first Americans, and their story begins in Siberia. Genetics has opened up a remarkable window into this deep past. By sequencing the DNA of ancient human remains and comparing it to the DNA of modern indigenous populations, we can sketch out a family tree that stretches back into the Ice Age. The lineage that would eventually lead to the first peoples of the Americas seems to have its deepest roots with a group we now call the ancient North Siberians. Archaeological evidence, like the incredible 31,000-year-old site at the Yana River in the Russian Arctic, gives us a glimpse into their lives. This site is astonishing. It's located far above the Arctic Circle. Even today, it's one of the coldest places on Earth. And 31,000 years ago, people were not just surviving there, they were thriving. The remains they left behind show us a people who were master hunters of the megafauna. They hunted woolly rhinos, bison, horses, and yes, mammoths. They had sophisticated tools, stone spear points, knives, and scrapers, but they also had tools made of ivory and bone. They carved beautiful, delicate beads from mammoth ivory. They made sharp, deadly spear points from rhino horn. And most importantly, they made needles, tiny, delicate needles, carved from bone. A bone needle might not sound as exciting as a giant spear point, but it is arguably the single most important piece of technology for surviving the Ice Age. You cannot survive in this kind of cold without tailored clothing. You can't just drape yourself in a loose animal hide. The wind, that relentless antagonist, will find its way in. You need to be able to cut and sew multiple layers of fur and leather together to create a sealed, insulated micro-environment around your body. You needed parkas with hoods, trousers, boots, and mittens. A well-made suit of Ice Age clothing was the difference between life and a very quick, very cold death. The bone needle was the key to unlocking that technology. It was their version of a spacesuit. Their shelters were also feats of ingenuity. On a treeless plain, you can't build a log cabin, so they used the materials at hand. At some sites, archaeologists have found the remains of dwellings constructed from the most abundant building material on the steppe. Mammoth bones. They would use the massive skulls and jaws as a foundation, the long leg bones and ribs as a framework, and the curving tusks as dramatic arched entranceways. They would then likely cover this bony skeleton with animal hides, weighing them down with more bones and stones. Inside, a fire, fueled by precious woody shrubs or, more often, by dry animal dung and fat-rich mammoth bones, would provide a small bubble of warmth and light against the vast frozen darkness of the Arctic winter. Imagine the inside of one of these homes, the air thick with the smoke of a bonfire, a smell that would be greasy and pungent, the walls made of hide, glistening with frost on the inside, the floor, a mix of dirt, moss, and discarded animal bits, the space crowded with people, bundled in furs, working on tools, cooking meat, telling stories while the wind howled outside like an angry ghost. It was a life lived in close quarters, a life of profound intimacy with the seasons, with the animals they hunted, and with each other. Community was not a lifestyle choice, it was the fundamental unit of survival. These ancient North Siberians were not, however, the direct ancestors of the first Americans. The genetic story is a little more complex and fascinating. It seems that around 25,000 years ago, the ancient North Siberian lineage mixed with another group coming from a bit further south and east, perhaps from the region around Lake Baikal or modern-day China. This mixing gave rise to a new, distinct population. We call them the Paleo-Siberians, and it is from this group, this blend of ancient peoples, that the ancestors of all Native Americans descend. For thousands of years, these Paleo-Siberian peoples lived and hunted on the mammoth steppe of northeastern Siberia. They perfected the art of Ice Age survival. Their toolkit was refined. They became masters of creating microblades, tiny, incredibly sharp flakes of stone that could be set into bone or antler handles to create complex, deadly and efficient composite tools like barbed harpoon points or knives that were far sharper than a simple stone flake. This was high technology for the time. It meant you could get more cutting edge out of a single piece of high-quality stone, a precious resource in many parts of the steppe. They lived this way for millennia, their lives governed by the movement of the great herds. They weren't aimless wanderers. They would have had a deep, intricate knowledge of their territory. Every hill, every river, the best places to find flint, the migratory routes of the bison, the places where the mammoths gathered in the spring. Their world was vast, but it was not empty. It was a landscape filled with meaning, with stories, and with the spirits of the animals they depended on. Then, around 20,000 years ago, the world entered the absolute nadir of the Ice Age. This period is called the Last Glacial Maximum, or LGM. The cold intensified. The ice sheets to the west and east swelled to their greatest size. The climate of Siberia became even harsher, even more brutally cold and dry. For many animal and human populations, this was a time of retreat. Life pulled back into more sheltered areas, known as refugia, where conditions were slightly less impossible. And this is where Beringia becomes so important. While much of the far north was becoming uninhabitable, this vast low-lying plain between the continents may have been one of those refugia because it was surrounded by the ocean on three sides. Even if those oceans were far away, the climate there was likely a bit more moderate, and I use that term very loosely, than in the continental interior of Siberia. It was still brutally cold, but perhaps with slightly less extreme temperature swings. It was a sanctuary. So at some point, probably following the herds of mammoth and bison that were also seeking better grazing, groups of these Paleo-Siberian hunters moved eastward from Siberia, out onto the Beringian plain. They weren't crossing a bridge to get to America, they were simply expanding their hunting grounds, moving into a new part of their world that happened to be a vast, exposed continental shelf. And here, it seems, they stayed for thousands of years. This idea is known as the Beringian standstill hypothesis. The genetics suggest that the ancestral Native American population became isolated from their Siberian cousins for a significant period, perhaps as long as 5,000 to 8,000 years. They were living in Beringia. It wasn't a highway, it was a homeland, a lost continent where an entire chapter of human history played out, a chapter that is now almost entirely lost to us, drowned beneath the sea. What was life like in Beringia? We can only speculate, as most of the archaeological evidence is now inaccessible. It was likely a continuation of the mammoth steppe lifestyle, but adapted to a new landscape. It wasn't all flat plain. There would have been rolling hills, river valleys, and perhaps more woody shrubs in sheltered areas, providing a crucial source of fuel. It was a world without the towering ice sheets that dominated the continents on either side. To the east, in Alaska, the way south was blocked by the confluence of two of those monstrous glaciers, the Laurentide sheet covering Canada and the Cordilleran sheet covering the Rocky Mountains. They met in a vast, impenetrable wall of ice. There was no way through, so the people waited, not consciously, of course. They were just living their lives, generation after generation, in this cold, wind-swept Ice Age refuge. They hunted, they raised their children, they told their stories under the pale light of the aurora borealis. They became a people of Beringia, their genes and their culture shaped by this unique lost world. They were, for all intents and purposes, trapped. They were caught between the harsh, depopulated steppes of Siberia to the west and the impassable wall of ice to the east. During this long period of isolation, their genetic makeup began to drift, becoming distinct from the populations back in Asia. The founding population of the Americas was being forged in this Beringian crucible. It was likely a relatively small population, perhaps only a few thousand individuals, whose descendants would go on to achieve something extraordinary. But the world, as always, was changing. The great planetary cycles that govern the ice ages were slowly, imperceptibly, beginning to shift. Around 17,000 years ago, the planet began to warm. The last glacial maximum was over. It wasn't a sudden heat wave. It was a slow 2 steps forward, 1 step back process that would take thousands of years. But the trend was undeniable. The great antagonist, the ice, was beginning to lose its grip. As the Earth warmed, the colossal ice sheets began to melt. This had 2 profound consequences. The first was that the water that had been locked up as ice for millennia began to pour back into the oceans. Slowly, inexorably, sea levels began to rise. The world's coastlines began to shrink, and Beringia, their homeland, began to disappear. The low-lying plains were the first to go. Year by year, generation by generation, the sea advanced, flooding the river valleys, turning plains into coastal marshes, and forcing the people and the animals they hunted onto higher and higher ground. The world they had known for thousands of years was slowly being taken from them. But the melting of the ice had a second, crucial consequence. As the Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets in North America began to shrink, a corridor started to open up between them. At first it would have been an apocalyptic landscape, a narrow, muddy channel of freshly exposed land, flanked by towering walls of unstable, melting ice on either side. Water would have been pouring down in torrents. Giant icebergs would have been carving off the glacier faces. It would have been a cold, sterile, and incredibly dangerous place. Not somewhere you'd want to go for a casual stroll. But over time, as the glaciers continued to retreat, the corridor would have widened, the ground would have stabilized. The first hardy pioneer plants, grasses and sedges, would have started to colonize the new land. And where the plants went, the animals followed. Herds of bison and horses, perhaps even mammoths, would have begun to venture south into this new, unexploited territory. And where the animals went, the hunters followed. The stage was now set. The people of Beringia were being pushed from their homeland by the rising sea, and at the same time, they were being pulled toward a new world by the lure of fresh hunting grounds. For the first time in millennia, a path was open, a path that led south into a continent that no human had ever seen before, a continent of unimaginable size and diversity, a world of new climates, new plants, and new animals. They didn't know what lay ahead. They couldn't have. They weren't intrepid explorers with a map and a mission. They were hunters, following their food source. They were parents, trying to find a secure future for their children. They were people, driven by the same fundamental human impulses that have always driven us: curiosity, need, and hope. As they stood at the threshold of this ice-free corridor, looking south, they were standing at one of the great turning points in human history. They were the product of 100,000 years of human evolution and adaptation. Their ancestors had survived the heat of Africa, the challenges of Asia, and the brutal grinding filter of the Siberian Ice Age. They were tough, intelligent, and supremely adaptable. They were about to step out of the old world of ice and mammoth and into a new world that they would, in time, make their own. Their long wait was over. The journey was about to begin. Chapter 2. Beringia, the Lost Continent, and the Great Migration. And so it did. The journey did begin. But this journey, it wasn't a sprint. It wasn't a panic dash across a frozen highway with a ticking clock and a clear destination in mind. We have to recalibrate our mental image here, the one we all have from school textbooks. We tend to picture a line of people, huddled in furs, leaning into a blizzard as they trudge single file across a narrow, precarious ice bridge. We see them with their eyes fixed on the horizon, on the prize of North America, waiting like a finish line on the other side. The reality, as it so often is, was far stranger, far slower, and infinitely more human. The very stage for this journey wasn't a bridge at all. To call it that is like calling the Amazon a creek. It was a place, a vast lost subcontinent, a world between worlds, that now has a name that sounds like a forgotten kingdom from a half-remembered fantasy novel. Beringia. Forget the image of a bridge. It's a completely unhelpful metaphor. Instead, I want you to imagine a landmass, a huge one. Imagine, if you will, taking the entire states of Texas and Oklahoma, picking them up, and gently placing them in the space that now separates Siberia from Alaska. That's the scale we're talking about. A place nearly 1,000 miles from north to south. A place you didn't just cross. A place you could get lost in. A place you could live in. A place where entire cultures could be born, could flourish, and could fade away without ever leaving a trace for us to find, because their entire world now sits quietly beneath the cold grey waters of the Bering and Chukchi seas. This was the world our Siberian ancestors stepped into, not a corridor, but a country. It wasn't a uniform landscape of ice and snow. Most of Beringia was what scientists call a mammoth steppe. It's a type of environment that doesn't really exist anywhere on Earth today. It wasn't the dense, dark forest of the taiga, nor was it the barren, frozen tundra we associate with the Arctic. It was a vast, cold, dry grassland, an immense rolling prairie that stretched from the Lena River in Siberia all the way to the Yukon in Canada, a continuous, seamless world. Let's try to picture it, to feel it. The air is thin and incredibly dry, so cold that it feels sharp in your lungs with every breath. The wind is a constant companion. There are no great forests to break its flow, so it scours the landscape, a relentless rushing presence that you can hear in your ears day and night. It whips snow into stinging clouds in the winter, and carries the scent of dry grass and distant herds in the short, frantic summer. The ground under your feet is permafrost, frozen solid for thousands of feet down, but the top layer thaws in the summer into a boggy, difficult terrain. The landscape isn't flat. It's a world of low, rolling hills, wide river valleys and sweeping plains that disappear into a haze at the horizon. The colour palette is subtle, dominated by the pale greens, golds and ochres of hardy grasses, sedges and sagebrush. There are dwarf willows and birches, but they huddle low to the ground in sheltered valleys, terrified of the wind. And the light would have been extraordinary. In the winter, the sun would be a weak, apologetic smear in the southern sky for a few hours a day, casting long blue shadows across the snow. The rest of the time was a deep, star-dusted twilight, or the profound, silent dark broken only by the shimmering, ghostly dance of the aurora borealis. Then, in the summer, the sun would barely dip below the horizon at all. For weeks on end it would circle the sky, a period of relentless 24-hour daylight, a mad rush of life where plants exploded into growth and animals foraged frantically to build up fat for the long darkness to come. This was not an empty world. This was the Serengeti of the Ice Age. It was teeming with life, with creatures that are now the stuff of legends and museum exhibits. Herds of woolly mammoths, colossal and shaggy, moved like walking hills across the plains, their tusks curving in magnificent, impractical arcs. There were herds of steppe bison, larger and more formidable than their modern cousins, and vast rivers of caribou and wild horses, their hooves thundering on the frozen ground. Woolly rhinos, like bad-tempered armoured vehicles, grazed on the tough grasses, and there were predators, of course. The scimitar-toothed cat, a terrifyingly efficient hunter, the giant short-faced bear, a creature that would make a modern grizzly look like a house pet, and packs of dire wolves, larger and more powerful than any wolf alive today. Into this world stepped a small population of humans. They came from Siberia, already masters of the cold, already experts in hunting these giant beasts. And when they arrived in the heart of Beringia, something remarkable happened. Or rather, something remarkably undramatic happened. They stopped. For a very, very long time. The dominant theory was called Clovis first. It was a neat and tidy story. About 13,500 years ago, the theory went. A group of big game hunters sprinted across the land bridge, found a convenient, newly opened corridor between the great ice sheets covering North America, and populated 2 entire continents in the geological blink of an eye. They were called the Clovis people, named after the elegant, fluted spear points they made, first found near Clovis, New Mexico. For decades, any archaeological site that seemed older than Clovis was dismissed, explained away, or quietly ignored. It was a good story, simple, elegant, and almost certainly wrong. The story began to unravel with genetics. By studying the DNA of modern indigenous Americans and comparing it to the DNA of modern Asian populations, geneticists could build a kind of family tree and estimate when these groups split from each other. And the genetics told a strange story. The split, the moment the ancestors of Native Americans became genetically isolated from their Siberian cousins, happened much, much earlier than the Clovis timeline. It happened somewhere between 25,000 and 15,000 years ago. But here's the puzzle. The evidence for people actually being in the Americas south of the ice sheets doesn't really get going until much later, around 16,000 years ago or so. So you have this gap, a gap of thousands, perhaps even 15,000 years, a period where these people were no longer in Siberia, but not yet in Alaska or the rest of the Americas. Where were they? What were they doing? They were in Beringia, and they weren't passing through, they were living there. This idea has a name, the Beringian standstill hypothesis. It sounds technical, but the concept is beautifully simple. Beringia wasn't a hallway, it was a waiting room, or, more accurately, it was a home. Think about what was happening in the world at the time, during the last glacial maximum, the absolute peak of the Ice Age. To the west, back in Siberia, the glaciers were expanding, making life even more difficult, and likely cutting them off from their ancestral homelands. To the east, North America was sealed shut. 2 colossal titans of ice, the Laurentide ice sheet and the Cordilleran ice sheet, were the gatekeepers. The Laurentide was a monster, covering almost all of modern Canada and the northern United States, in places 2 miles thick. The Cordilleran covered the mountain ranges of the west coast. For most of the Ice Age, these 2 ice sheets were fused together, forming an impassable wall of ice thousands of miles long. They were the world's most effective bouncers, and the guest list for the party in the Americas was completely empty. So this small founding population of humans was caught in the middle, trapped in this vast, cold, but surprisingly resource-rich land of Beringia. And they stayed. They didn't stay for a long weekend. They didn't stay for a generation. They stayed for somewhere between 5 and 15,000 years. Let that number sink in for a moment. 5,000 years is the entire span of recorded human history, from the invention of writing in Sumeria to the present day. 15,000 years is 3 times that. It is a span of time so vast as to be almost incomprehensible. It's about 600 generations. These people weren't waiting. They were living. In their own minds, they weren't migrants on their way somewhere else. They were Beringians. This was their world, their homeland. Imagine the culture that would develop over that time. A culture born and perfectly adapted to the Mammoth steppe. Their entire universe would have been shaped by the rhythm of this lost world. The long, dark winters spent in semi-subterranean houses, insulated by sod and snow, huddled around fires fueled by animal dung and willow branches. The telling of stories, the mending of tools, the slow work of turning hides into warm, life-saving clothing. The spiritual world they would have built, a world populated by the spirits of the mammoth, the bison, and the wind itself. Their language would have evolved in isolation. Their technology would have been refined to a razor's edge of efficiency for this specific environment. They would have known the migration patterns of the caribou, the way a modern city dweller knows the subway map. They would have known which valleys offered the best protection from the winter storms, which slopes the mammoths preferred in the spring. A child born in Beringia 20,000 years ago wouldn't have heard tales of a forgotten homeland in Asia. Their great, add another 500 greats, grandmother wasn't dreaming of buffalo in Wyoming. She was dreaming of a successful hunt for a steppe bison just over the next rise, a hunt that would mean the difference between life and another frozen, silent death. This vast period of isolation also explains the genetic data perfectly. It was during this standstill that the unique genetic markers that define all indigenous Americans first appeared and solidified. They were a distinct people, forged in the crucible of this Ice Age refuge. They weren't Siberians anymore, and they weren't yet Americans. They were Beringians. And then, after millennia of waiting, the world began to change. The great global deep freeze started to ease. The planet began to warm up, slowly, erratically, and as the world warmed, the ice began to melt. The two great bouncers at the door to North America, the Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets, began to retreat. They started to pull apart from each other, like immense, slow-motion curtains parting on a stage, and in between them, a path began to open. This brings us to the great debate, the central drama of American archaeology for the last half-century. How did they finally get out of Beringia and into the rest of the Americas? For a long time, there was only one answer, one theory that reigned supreme. It was the story of the ice-free corridor. The idea is straightforward. As the two great ice sheets melted, a gap appeared between them, running southeast from what is now the Yukon, down the eastern flank of the Rocky Mountains, and eventually opening out onto the Great Plains of central North America. This gap, this corridor, was the gateway. As soon as it was passable, the theory goes, the Beringians, who had been patiently waiting for just this opportunity, poured through it, found a hunter's paradise teeming with naive megafauna, and spread with explosive speed. It's a powerful image, but let's think about what that journey would have actually been like. This wasn't a scenic stroll down a grassy valley. The corridor, when it first opened, would have been one of the most bleak and forbidding landscapes on the planet. Imagine walking into it. On either side of you for 1,000 miles are walls of ice, hundreds or even thousands of feet high. The ice is constantly groaning, cracking and carving with sounds like thunder. The air is damp and bone-chillingly cold, a permanent refrigeration unit. The wind, channeled between these two mountains of ice, would have howled relentlessly. And the ground would have been a nightmare. It would be a chaotic mess of gravel, silt and boulders left behind by the retreating glaciers, what geologists call glacial till. There would be no soil to speak of, and there would be water everywhere. The melting ice would form vast temporary lakes, what are called proglacial lakes. These lakes were infamous for bursting through ice dams, creating biblical-scale floods that would scour the landscape. You might be walking through the corridor one day, and the next, your path is gone, replaced by a raging torrent of ice-cold water 100 feet deep. Most importantly, for the first few centuries after it opened, the corridor would have been biologically sterile, utterly barren. There were no plants, no trees, no moss, nothing. And if there are no plants, there are no animals to eat the plants. And if there are no plant eaters, there are no predators to eat them. For the first people to enter that corridor, it would have been a journey of 1,000 miles through a world with literally nothing to eat. They would have had to carry all of their food with them. It was a commitment, a one-way ticket through the world's longest, coldest and dampest back alley. For a long time this was the accepted story, but it had a problem, a major scheduling conflict. Geologists studying the corridor have determined that it likely wasn't fully open and biologically viable, a lovely scientific term for not a sterile wasteland of ice and rock, until about 14,000, maybe 13,500 years ago. And here's the rub. Archaeologists started finding things that were in the wrong place, at the wrong time. The most famous, the site that truly broke the Clovis first model, was found in a place you would least expect it, southern Chile. The site is called Monte Verde, and it's a time capsule, preserved under a layer of peat in a bog. Archaeologists found the remains of a small settlement on a riverbank. They found the footprints of a child. They found remnants of wooden huts, stone tools, bits of animal hide, and even preserved medicinal plants, still fragrant after more than 14 millennia. It was an incredible window into the lives of these first Americans, and it was old, Radiocarbon dating showed the main settlement at Monte Verde was at least 14,500 years old. That's a full 1,000 years before the Clovis culture appears in North America. And, crucially, it's at least 1,000 years before the ice-free corridor was a pleasant place for a stroll. Think about the implications. To have people living in southern Chile 14,500 years ago means their ancestors must have left Beringia much earlier. They would have had to travel the entire length of 2 continents, crossing the Isthmus of Panama, navigating the Amazon basin, and climbing the Andes. That is a journey of epic proportions, one that would take centuries if not millennia. It simply could not have happened if the only way out of Beringia was a corridor that wasn't even open for business yet. It was like finding a Roman coin in Australia. The timeline was broken. Monte Verde was the first major crack in the old theory. Others followed. In the Paisley Caves in Oregon, scientists found human coprolites, that is, fossilized poop. And yes, history sometimes comes down to the study of fantastically old poop. These particular specimens, radiocarbon dated to 14,300 years ago, not only predated Clovis, but DNA extracted from them confirmed they were from humans of Asian ancestry. In Florida, stone tools were found alongside the bones of a butchered mastodon, dating to 14,050 years ago. All over North and South America, the evidence was piling up. People were here, south of the ice, long before the ice-free corridor was a viable option. So, if they didn't come through the corridor, how did they get there? This led archaeologists and thinkers to look again at the map, to consider an alternative, and they saw the other great potential highway, the coast. This is the second great theory, the coastal migration route, or, more poetically, the Kelp Highway. The idea is this: what if the first Americans didn't walk at all? What if they came by boat? The logic is compelling. While the interior of the continent was locked behind a wall of ice, the Pacific coast might have been a different story. The warming climate would have affected the coastal glaciers of the Cordilleranan ice sheet first. Small pockets of ice-free land called refugia may have existed along the coast, like islands in a sea of ice. People in simple boats, perhaps hide-covered kayaks, not unlike those used by Arctic peoples in historic times, could have skipped from one refuge to another, leapfrogging their way down the coast. This wasn't a journey into a barren wasteland. The coast, even an Ice Age coast, is an incredibly rich environment. It's an ecotone, a place where 2 ecosystems meet, and they are always bursting with life. Instead of a sterile tunnel of ice, picture a vibrant, endless seafood buffet. There would have been seals, sea lions, otters, and walruses. There would have been seabirds nesting on cliffs by the millions. The tidal zones would be packed with shellfish, mussels, clams, oysters, an easily gathered and reliable source of protein, and the nearshore waters would have been home to dense forests of kelp. These kelp forests are one of the most productive ecosystems on Earth. They provide food and shelter for a huge variety of fish and marine mammals, and they create a continuous, predictable environment that stretches from Japan, up past Siberia, across the southern coast of Beringia, and all the way down the coast of the Americas to Chile. A group of people who knew how to exploit the resources of the kelp forest in one part of the world would have the skills to do so anywhere else along its length. They wouldn't need to learn a whole new way of life every time they moved. They could follow this kelp highway south. Travel by boat is also vastly more efficient than walking. A family in a small boat can cover far more ground in a day than a family on foot, and they can carry more gear with them. They wouldn't be venturing into the unknown. They would always have the sea on one side and the land on the other. They could pull ashore every night, set up a temporary camp, feast on shellfish, and set out again the next morning. It would have been a challenging journey, to be sure, facing rough seas and coastal storms, but it was predictable, it was sustainable, and most importantly, it neatly bypasses the entire problem of the ice-free corridor. They could have been slipping down the coast thousands of years before the ice sheets parted. This theory perfectly explains how people could be as far south as Monte Verde in Chile so very early. They simply never had to deal with the ice in the interior. So why wasn't this the leading theory all along? One very big, very wet problem: rising sea levels. The world our coastal migrants travelled through is gone. As the great ice sheets melted, all of that water flowed back into the oceans, global sea levels have risen by more than 300 feet since the end of the Ice Age. The ancient coastline, the beaches where they would have landed their boats, the caves where they might have sheltered, the middens of shells they would have left behind, it's all underwater now. Finding a 16,000-year-old campsite is hard enough on dry land. Finding one on the continental shelf under 300 feet of cold, murky Pacific Ocean is an archaeological needle in a haystack of epic proportions. You don't just need a trowel, you need a remote-operated submersible and a whole lot of luck. So for now, the evidence for the coastal route is largely circumstantial. It's a beautiful, logical theory that fits the timeline, but the direct, hard evidence is maddeningly elusive. Washed away by time and tide, we have found a few tantalizing clues. On the Channel Islands off the coast of California, archaeologists have found beautifully made, delicate stone points, very different from Clovis points, that were used for hunting on the water, dating back 12,000 years. On islands in British Columbia, places that would have been accessible only by boat, we are starting to find sites that are 13,000 or 14,000 years old. The search continues, pushing the boundaries of underwater archaeology. So which was it? The cold, dark alleyway of the corridor, or the scenic, soggy coastal route? The answer, which is often the case in the messy story of our past, is probably yes. It was likely both. We need to stop thinking of the peopling of the Americas as a single event, a cavalry charge of Clovis hunters. It was almost certainly a much more complex, multi-stage process. A slow trickle, perhaps, rather than a flood. Perhaps the very first arrivals were the coastal people, the masters of the Kelp Highway. They might have been working their way down the coast as early as 18,000 or 20,000 years ago. A slow, generational expansion. They were a maritime culture, at home on the sea, their lives tied to the rhythm of the tides and the bounty of the ocean. They may have spread far and wide, reaching the tip of South America while their distant cousins were still living in central Beringia. Then, a few thousand years later, the great ice sheets finally parted. The ice-free corridor became a reality. It may not have been a pleasant journey, but it was a possible one, and a different group of people, perhaps those who had lived in the interior of Beringia, the descendants of the mammoth hunters of the steppe, saw an opportunity. They were a terrestrial people, big game hunters adapted to the plains, and as they emerged from the southern end of the corridor, they found themselves in a world that was, for them, a paradise. A continent filled with vast herds of mammoth, mastodon, giant bison and horses that had never seen a human before, that had no innate fear of a small bipedal ape with a sharp stick. This second wave may have been the people we call Clovis. Their technology, those lethally effective fluted points, was perfectly suited for hunting these giant animals, and they spread with incredible speed across the interior of North America, their culture flourishing for a brief, spectacular few centuries before the megafauna they hunted began to disappear, and their world changed forever. So the story is not one people, one route, one time. It's a story of multiple waves, of different peoples, with different skills, taking different paths at different times. Some came by sea, hugging the coast, their story now largely lost to the waves. Others came by land, walking through that impossible corridor of ice, their story written in the stone points they left scattered across the plains. The journey out of the old world was not a single, heroic leap. It was a long, complex, and deeply human process. It began with that incredible period of waiting, of adaptation and evolution on the lost continent of Beringia. It was a pause that lasted for millennia, a time when a new people were forged, isolated from the rest of humanity. And when the gates of the new world finally creaked open, they were ready. They possessed the skills, the technology, and the incredible resilience to take on not just a new land, but an entire hemisphere. They had conquered the challenge of the journey. They had passed through the filter of the ice. Now they stood at the threshold of a truly new world, a world of incredible promise, and of dangers they could not yet imagine. The Great Migration was over, but the story of their conquest, of how they adapted to and transformed this vast empty continent, was only just beginning. Chapter 3. The Clovis Culture and the Art of the Mammoth Hunt. And so, this new world, this empty canvas, awaited its first true signature. For a story as immense as the peopling of a continent, The beginning of the next chapter isn't found in a grand monument or a sprawling city, but in something you could hold in the palm of your hand. It's found in a piece of stone so distinctive, so beautifully and ruthlessly engineered, that it acted as the calling card for the first widespread, identifiable culture of the Americas. Finding one of these in the soil is like finding a specific brand logo, a cultural thumbprint left behind some 13,000 years ago. We call the people who made them the Clovis culture, named for the town in New Mexico near where their artifacts were first found in a context that couldn't be ignored. And the story of their conquest, their adaptation, is inextricably linked to the magnificent, terrifying beasts they hunted with these tools. Their story is the story of the mammoth hunters. To understand these people, we have to start with that tool, the Clovis point. Now, if you've ever picked up a random arrowhead, you might think you have a general idea, a sharp piece of rock, but that's like saying a high-performance sports car is just a metal box with wheels. A Clovis point is a different category of object altogether. It's a masterpiece of physics, geology, and lethal artistry. It wasn't just a sharp rock, it was a solution. It was the answer to a very specific and very large problem, a problem that could weigh over 10 tons and stood 13 feet at the shoulder. Imagine you're a Clovis napper. Your job, your entire purpose in this moment, is to create one of these tools. Your life and the lives of your family literally depend on your skill. First, you can't just use any old rock you find by the river. You need the good stuff. You need high-quality chert, flint, obsidian, or chalcedony. These are cryptocrystalline silicate rocks, which is a wonderfully sleepy and scientific way of saying they break in a predictable, controllable way. They fracture like glass, with what's called a conchoidal fracture. You hit it just right, and a flake shears off in a smooth, curved, shell-like shape. Your people have known this for generations, a body of knowledge passed down from the old world. But here, in this new continent, you have to be a walking geological survey. You have to know where the good quarries are. Some Clovis groups travelled hundreds of miles to source the absolute best stone, the stuff that was strong, held a razor edge, and had just the right internal structure. They were, in a very real sense, material scientists. You find your prized nodule of flint. It's heavy and cool in your hands. Now the work begins. This isn't about brute force, it's about precision. You take a hammerstone, a hard, dense river cobble, and you begin with percussion flaking, big, sharp strikes to knock off the rough outer cortex and shape the general outline of the point. It's a process of removal, of revealing the form hidden inside the stone. Each strike is a decision. A mistake can ruin the whole piece, wasting a valuable resource and hours of effort. The ground around you is littered with the sharp debris of past work, a testament to this constant focused industry. Once you have the rough shape, what archaeologists call a biface, the technique changes. You put away the heavy hammerstone. Now you bring out a tool made of antler or bone, something softer than the stone you're working. This is for pressure flaking. You press the tip of this tool against the edge of the stone biface and apply steady, controlled pressure until a long, thin, beautiful flake ripples off the surface. It's a delicate, intimate process. You are feeling the internal tensions of the rock, guiding the fracture with your body. You do this again and again, thinning the point, refining its edges until they are terrifyingly sharp. The finished edges are so acute, they can rival modern surgical scalpels. But here is where the Clovis napper performs the signature move, the final, brilliant touch that defines the culture. The flute. After the point is almost finished, a product of incredible skill, you undertake the most difficult and risky step of all. You prepare a small platform at the base of the point. Then, with a single perfect strike, or a powerful push, you drive a long channel flake from the base up towards the tip. You do this on both sides. This channel, this flute, is the Clovis trademark, and for decades, archaeologists have debated its exact purpose. Why risk the entire point on this one final difficult maneuver? The answer is a marvel of Stone Age engineering. This flute wasn't for decoration. It was a functional innovation of the highest order. It created a thinned, concave channel at the base, which allowed the point to be seated securely into a groove in the end of a spear shaft. Imagine trying to attach a thick, lens-shaped point to a wooden shaft. It would be a clumsy, weak joint, but with the flute, The point nestles deep inside the shaft. When bound tightly with sinew and sealed with pitch or resin, it creates an incredibly strong, shock-resistant connection. When this spear strikes something as immense and dense as a mammoth, the force of the impact is distributed across the entire haft, reducing the chance of the point snapping off at the base. It was the solution to the problem of creating a weapon that could withstand the violent collision of the hunt. It was, in its own way, a suspension system, a small, ingenious detail that allowed a small group of humans to effectively transfer kinetic energy into a creature the size of a bus. This single idea, the fluted point, spread across an entire continent with incredible speed, from Nova Scotia to northern Mexico, from California to Florida. Archaeologists find these points. They vary slightly in size and the specific type of stone used, but they are all unmistakably Clovis. This wasn't just a tool, it was a shared technology, a shared idea. It suggests a network of highly mobile groups, all facing similar challenges, who were in contact with one another, sharing information across a vast, pristine landscape. The Clovis point was the symbol of their mastery over this new world. It was their answer to the question, how do you survive here? How do you thrive? Of course, the point, as brilliant as it was only the tip of the spear, both literally and figuratively. It was part of a sophisticated, modular weapon system. The Clovis point itself wasn't usually attached directly to the main spear shaft. Instead, it was often hafted onto a shorter piece of bone, ivory, or hardened wood, known as a foreshaft. This foreshaft then fits snugly into a socket on the main spear shaft. If you threw your spear and the point got stuck in the animal, or broke on a bone, you didn't lose your entire carefully crafted spear. You could simply pull the main shaft out, fit a new foreshaft, and point into the socket, and you were ready to go again. It was efficient, it was practical, and it was a sign of people who planned for failure and optimized their gear for the harsh realities of the hunt. And they weren't just throwing these spears with their arms, they had a secret weapon, a force multiplier that allowed them to hunt animals far outside their weight class. They had the atlatl. The atlatl, or spear thrower, is a simple but revolutionary piece of technology. It's essentially a stick with a handle at one end and a hook or spur at the other that engages the base of the spear. By holding the atlatl and throwing the spear from it, you are effectively lengthening your arm. It acts as a lever, dramatically increasing the velocity and range of the projectile. A spear thrown with an atlatl can travel at speeds exceeding 90 miles per hour, hitting its target with enough force to pierce the thick hide and muscle of a mammoth. It was the pinnacle of Paleolithic ballistic technology. It allowed a hunter to deliver a lethal payload from a safer distance. You didn't have to get into trampling range. You could be a deadly predator from 50 yards away. The combination of the atlatl's power and the Clovis point's penetrative design was the key to their success. The rest of their toolkit was just as practical, just as purpose-built. They carried large bifacial knives, some shaped like crescents for the heavy-duty work of butchering. They had an array of unifacial scrapers. Stone flakes worked only on one side to create a durable, sharp edge, perfect for cleaning hides. There were tiny, sharp gravers for etching bone and ivory, and burins for splitting them. Each tool was an extension of their hands, a physical manifestation of their knowledge. When archaeologists excavate a Clovis site, they don't just find spear points, they find the entire processing kit, the evidence of a people who were not just hunters but butchers, tanners, and craftsmen. A mammoth wasn't just a meal, it was a walking hardware store, and the Clovis people had the exact set of tools needed to disassemble it and use every single part. Now let's take a moment to properly meet the primary object of their attention, the Columbian mammoth. If your mental image of a mammoth is the short, shaggy, woolly mammoth from the cartoons, you need to adjust your picture. The woolly mammoth was a creature of the high Arctic steppe. The animal that roamed the temperate plains of North America was the Columbian mammoth, Mammothus columbi, and it was a giant. It stood up to 14 feet at the shoulder, far taller than a modern African elephant. It could weigh 10, even 12 tons. Its tusks could grow up to 16 feet long, curving majestically. It was less hairy than its northern cousin, better adapted to the warmer climes of the continental interior. To a small band of Clovis hunters, a herd of these animals would have been an awe-inspiring sight. They were the architects of the landscape, moving in family groups, led by a wise matriarch. They were intelligent, social creatures, and they were incredibly dangerous. A healthy adult mammoth had no natural predators. It was a mountain of muscle and bone, capable of trampling anything in its path and wielding its enormous tusks with deadly intent. Hunting one wasn't just a challenge, it was arguably the most dangerous undertaking a human being could attempt. It required more than just courage and sharp sticks. It required a plan. It required strategy, teamwork, and an intimate knowledge of both the animal and the land. The popular image of a mammoth hunt is often one of chaotic heroism. A band of hunters clad in furs, yelling as they charge a bellowing giant, bravely jabbing at its legs. That's a good way to get your entire hunting party turned into a thin paste. The reality, as reconstructed from the archaeological evidence, was far more subtle, more calculated, and in many ways more impressive. This was not a contest of strength, it was a contest of intellect. The first step was selection. You don't pick a fight with the biggest, strongest bull in the herd. That's a form of suicide. Clovis hunters were strategic. They looked for weakness. They would track a herd for days, observing, learning its rhythms. They would target a lone individual, an animal that had become separated from the safety of the group. Or they might target a younger animal, not a calf protected by its mother, but perhaps a subadult, not yet fully experienced or powerful. An older animal, past its prime, might also be a viable target. They were looking for an edge, a slight advantage in a contest where the stakes were absolute. The next step was to use the landscape as their primary weapon. They were masters of topography. They understood how to use hills, cliffs, and streams to their advantage. A favorite tactic seems to have been cornering an animal in a place where its size and power became a liability. An arroyo, a steep-sided wash, was a perfect natural trap. If they could drive a mammoth into the narrow confines of a canyon, its movement would be restricted. It couldn't turn easily. It couldn't charge effectively. The hunters, perched on the rim above, would have a massive advantage. Bogs and the marshy edges of ponds were another excellent option. Lure the mammoth into soft ground where it would become mired, its powerful legs sinking into the mud, immobilizing it. The animal's greatest strengths, its weight and power, were turned against it. Once the animal was in a compromised position, the attack would begin. This wasn't a single, decisive moment, but a sustained, coordinated assault. The hunters would use their atlatls to launch a volley of spears. The goal wasn't necessarily an instant kill, which would have been nearly impossible. You can't just drop a 10-ton animal with a stone-tipped spear. The goal was to wound, to bleed, to weaken. They would aim for the large muscle groups, the soft underbelly, the area behind the shoulder where the lungs and heart lay deep inside the chest cavity. Each point that found its mark was a small victory, opening a wound that would drain the animal's strength and stamina. Imagine the scene, the terrifying trumpeting of the wounded animal, echoing off the canyon walls, the whistles and calls of the hunters as they coordinate their movements, the rhythmic hiss and thud of the spears. It was a battle of attrition. The hunters were patient. They would inflict a series of wounds and then pull back, letting shock and blood loss do their work. They might track the bleeding animal for hours, even days, waiting for it to weaken, to lie down, to finally succumb. It was a grim, brutal business, but it was brutally effective. We know this isn't just speculation because of the incredible crime scenes the Clovis people left behind, frozen in time. In 1951, near the town of Naco, Arizona, a rancher discovered the fossilized bones of a mammoth eroding out of the bank of an arroyo. When archaeologists excavated it, they found a stunning tableau. Embedded in and around the skeleton of a single Columbian mammoth were 8 perfect Clovis points. One was near the skull, another by a vertebra. 2 were found within the shoulder blades. This was not an animal that had died of old age and been scavenged. This was the irrefutable evidence of a successful hunt. The Naco mammoth was a snapshot of the final lethal moments of a Clovis encounter. Just a few miles away is another site, the Lena Ranch site. Here, the story gets even richer. Archaeologists uncovered the remains of not one, but at least 13 mammoths, concentrated in an ancient river channel. Most of them were juveniles or young adults. Scattered among their bones were 19 Clovis points and 8 stone butchering tools. This wasn't just a kill site, it was a processing plant. It tells us that these weren't just lone, opportunistic hunts. This was a massive, coordinated effort to acquire a huge amount of resources. The Lena site gives us a glimpse of the aftermath, of the monumental task that began once the great beast was finally still. And then there's the famous Blackwater Draw locality in New Mexico. This was an ancient watering hole, a place that drew animals for millennia, and where the animals went, the hunters followed. At Blackwater Draw, archaeologists found a beautifully stratified record of human history. At the bottom, in the oldest layer, they found Clovis points mixed with the bones of mammoth and giant bison. In the layer directly above it, they found the tools of a later culture, the Folsom people, mixed with the bones of a smaller, extinct species of bison. This site was crucial because it established a timeline. It proved, unequivocally, that the Clovis people were the predecessors, the first in a long line of Paleo-Indian hunters. It was a favourite spot on the landscape, a reliable place to find game, a sort of Paleolithic drive-through that was used for generations. These sites paint a vivid picture of the hunt, but they also hint at the enormous social effort that followed. Killing a mammoth is only half the battle. Now you have 10 tons of meat, hide and bone on the ground, and you're in a race against time. Every predator and scavenger in the area, dire wolves, short-faced bears, saber-toothed cats, has smelled the blood and is on its way, and the meat itself will begin to spoil in the sun. So the moment the mammoth is down, the entire band, which may have been watching from a safe distance, descends upon the carcass. The scene transforms from a tense hunt into a frenzy of organized labor. The air fills with the sounds of chopping, the sharp cracks of stone on bone, and the excited chatter of the group. Everyone has a job. The lead hunters, perhaps, direct the operation. Stronger individuals use large stone choppers, and the animal's own tusk as levers to break down the massive limbs. Others, with deft hands and razor-sharp flint knives, begin the delicate process of skinning. The hide of a mammoth was over an inch thick. Peeling it back would have been an immense task requiring immense strength and skill. But that hide was a priceless resource, essential for making shelter, clothing, and containers. Once the hide was off, the butchering began in earnest. This was not a random hacking apart of the animal. They had a deep, practical understanding of animal anatomy. They knew where the best cuts of meat were, how to disarticulate the massive joints at the shoulder and hip, how to strip the long muscles from the bones. The meat would be cut into long, thin strips and laid out on racks, or hung from trees to dry in the sun and wind, creating a nutrient-dense, long-lasting jerky that could fuel them for weeks or months. The massive organs, the liver, the heart, the kidneys, were rich in vitamins and were likely eaten immediately, a fresh feast after the arduous hunt. The fat was a critical resource. It would be rendered down into tallow, a high-energy food source that could be stored and used for cooking, or as a sealant, or even as fuel for simple lamps. And nothing, absolutely nothing, was wasted. The long bones, rich in marrow, would be cracked open. Marrow is one of the most calorie-dense foods in nature, a vital part of their diet. The bones themselves could be used as tools, as anvils for knapping, or even as fuel for fires in a landscape where wood might be scarce. The stomach and intestines could be cleaned and used as water containers. The sinews and tendons could be dried and processed into strong cordage for hafting tools and sewing clothes. Even the brain was a valuable resource, used in the tanning process to soften the hides. A single mammoth kill was a logistical enterprise of staggering proportions. It was their version of a stimulus package, an enormous infusion of calories and raw materials that could sustain a group for an entire season. It was the foundation of their economy. This intense focus on mammoth hunting has, at times, led to a caricature of the Clovis people as one-dimensional mammoth slayers. But that's an oversimplification. They were highly adaptable, generalist foragers. A mammoth was a high-risk, high-reward prize. It was the big jackpot. But you can't live on jackpots alone. Their daily diet would have consisted of a much wider array of foods. They hunted other animals, the giant bison antiquus, which was a quarter larger than modern bison, as well as ancient species of horse, camel, and deer. They likely hunted smaller game like rabbits and birds. They fished in the rivers and lakes that dotted the post-glacial landscape. And they were certainly eating plants. While plant remains don't preserve as well as stone tools and mammoth bones, we can be sure they had a deep botanical knowledge. They knew which roots were edible, which berries were sweet, which seeds could be ground into flour. They were, above all, pragmatists. They ate what the land provided. The mammoths were the centerpiece of their survival strategy, the great walking storehouses that allowed them to flourish, but their world was much richer and more varied than just the hunt. So what was their life like in between these epic hunts? The evidence suggests they lived in small, mobile family groups, what we call bands, perhaps 20 to 50 people, a collection of parents, children, aunts, uncles and cousins. They didn't build permanent villages. Their homes were likely simple, transportable structures, perhaps hide tents stretched over a framework of wood or mammoth bones, similar to the tipis of later plains cultures. Their home was not a single location, but a vast territory that they moved through with the changing seasons. They would follow the migratory herds, move to lower elevations in the winter, and higher ones in the summer. They knew the location of every important resource in their territory, the best stone quarries, the most reliable watering holes, the groves where nut-bearing trees grew. Their existence was a constant rhythm of movement. Life was lived on foot, carrying everything they owned on their backs, and yet these small, scattered groups were not isolated. The fact that the Clovis point technology is so uniform across thousands of miles tells us they were in contact. There must have been periodic gatherings, perhaps at a particularly abundant hunting ground or a sacred site. Here, different bands would come together. They would trade high-quality stone, share information about the movement of game, arrange marriages, and conduct ceremonies. It was at these gatherings that the social fabric of the Clovis world was woven, connecting disparate groups into a continent-spanning cultural network. And what of their inner world, their beliefs, their spirituality? This is the hardest thing for archaeology to touch. We have their tools, their campfire hearths, the bones of the animals they ate. We don't have their stories, their songs, their prayers, but there are tantalizing clues. The craftsmanship of their points often goes far beyond what is purely functional. Some are made of beautiful, colorful, or even translucent stone, knapped with a symmetry and precision that is breathtaking. Was this just pride in one's work, or was there a spiritual dimension to it? Did a well-made point honor the spirit of the animal it was meant to take? Did it contain some power, some magic, to guide the hunter's hand? At some sites, archaeologists have found caches of Clovis points, dozens of them, often unusually large and beautifully made, buried together. Some are covered in red ochre, a pigment that has been associated with ritual and burial across the world for tens of thousands of years. Were these offerings, gifts to the spirits of the earth? We can't know for sure, but they hint at a complex ceremonial life. Perhaps the most poignant glimpse into their world comes from a site in Montana, the Anzick site. Here, in 1968, the burial of a single infant child was discovered. The child, a boy, had been laid to rest some 12,600 years ago, and he had not been buried alone. With him were placed over 100 stone and bone tools, including several magnificent Clovis points, and all of them were coated in that same symbolic red ochre. This is the only known Clovis burial, and it is a powerful testament to their humanity. This was not a world of unfeeling, brutish survivalists. This was a world of people who loved their children, who mourned their dead, and who believed in a reality beyond the physical. They took the most valuable objects their culture produced, tools essential for their survival, and they offered them to a lost child, perhaps to accompany him on a journey to another world. In that single silent grave, we feel the profound grief and love of a family from the dawn of American history. The Clovis people were an incredible success story. In the span of just a few centuries, they spread across an entire continent, adapting to a huge range of environments, from forests to plains to deserts. Their toolkit, perfected for the hunting of megafauna, was so effective that it became the dominant technology from coast to coast. For a time, they were the undisputed masters of the Ice Age world. But their world was about to change in a way that no amount of skill or courage could overcome. The great ice sheets that had defined their world for millennia were in their final retreat. The climate was warming rapidly, and then, around 12,900 years ago, something dramatic happened. The planet was suddenly plunged back into a period of intense cold and drought that lasted for over 1,000 years. We call this period the Younger Dryas. The forests and grasslands that the mammoths and other megafauna depended on began to shift and shrink. The old rules of the landscape were being rewritten, and at the same time, these animals were facing a new and incredibly efficient predator for the first time. The combination was devastating. Within a few centuries of the onset of the Younger Dryas, the world of the Clovis people vanished. The great mammoths and mastodons, the horses, the camels, the giant sloths, they all disappeared from the face of the continent forever. An entire ecosystem that had existed for millennia simply collapsed. Did the Clovis hunters hunt the mammoths to extinction? This is the heart of the great overkill hypothesis debate. Were they simply too good at their job? It's unlikely to be that simple. They were almost certainly a major contributing factor. The pressure of this new deadly predator on animal populations that had never experienced it before must have been immense, but it was likely a combination of factors, a perfect storm of climate change altering the habitat, and a new predator exploiting the stressed populations. The Clovis people were not malicious. They were simply trying to survive, using the strategies that had always worked. But the world changed from under their feet, and the central pillar of their existence, the great mammoth, crumbled. With the disappearance of the megafauna, the Clovis way of life also came to an end. Their specialized toolkit, so perfectly designed for hunting giants, was no longer the optimal solution. The culture itself seems to fragment, to adapt. New regional traditions emerge, with new types of projectile points, new strategies for hunting the smaller, faster game that now dominated the landscape, like the modern bison. The great continent-spanning uniformity of the Clovis culture gives way to a mosaic of local adaptations. The Clovis people didn't die out, so much as their children and grandchildren became something new. They became the Folsom people, the Dalton people, the ancestors of the incredible diversity of cultures that would eventually blanket the Americas. The Clovis era was a brief but spectacular chapter in the human story. It was a time of epic hunts and vast open landscapes, a time when humanity, armed with little more than stone, wood, and an incredible intellect, stood face to face with the giants of the Ice Age and prevailed. They were the trailblazers, the true pioneers of North America, and in the grooved channels of a single beautifully crafted stone point, they left behind a story of ingenuity, resilience, and the conquest of a new world, a story that still whispers to us from the ancient earth. Their time was ending, but the stage was now set for the next act in the great human drama of the Americas. The age of the mammoth was over. The age of the bison was about to begin. Chapter 4. Chapter 4. A Continent of Ghosts. The Quaternary Extinction Event. The age of the bison was about to begin, but for that to happen, a space had to be cleared. The great ecological stage of North America, for millennia crowded with a cast of colossal characters, suddenly had a number of job openings, very large job openings. The mammoths were gone, the mastodons were gone, but they didn't leave alone. Their departure was part of a much larger, much stranger, and much faster vanishing act. And this is where our story takes a turn, from a tale of human triumph to one of the planet's great and enduring mysteries. We're moving from the hunters to the ghosts they left behind. Imagine for a moment the world the first Americans had entered. It wasn't just a land of mammoths and endless ice. It was a continent, teeming with life so strange, so fantastical, that it almost feels like a different planet. Picture a sloth. You're probably thinking of the slow-moving, slightly goofy creature hanging from a tree in the Amazon. Now imagine a sloth that is 20 feet long and weighs as much as an elephant. A creature so massive it didn't need to climb trees, it could just pull them down to get at the leaves. This was Megatherium, the giant ground sloth, and it was just one of the locals. There were beavers, the size of black bears, busily engineering waterways on a scale we can barely comprehend. There were glyptodonts, which looked like someone tried to build a Volkswagen Beetle out of an armadillo shell. Creatures so heavily armored they were essentially walking, grass-eating tanks. Roaming the plains were camels and horses, not the ones we know from other parts of the world, but native North American versions that had been here for millions of years. And then there were the predators. We think of saber-toothed cats, Smilodon, with those iconic, terrifying fangs, but they were hardly alone. There was the American lion, 25% larger than its modern African cousin, a true king of beasts, and dwarfing them all was the short-faced bear, Arctivers, a creature of nightmares. Standing on its hind legs, it could have peered into a second-story window, It was taller, faster, and built more like a cheetah than a bear, designed for running down prey on the open plains. It was a predator so formidable that for the early humans, the correct survival strategy upon seeing one was probably to just lie down and get it over with. This was the world, a vibrant, thrumming, deeply established ecosystem. And then, in the geological blink of an eye, right around the time our Clovis hunters were perfecting their craft, it all went silent. Over 75% of North America's large animal species, anything over about 100 pounds, vanished. Gone. Not a slow decline, but a catastrophic collapse. The ground stopped shaking from the tread of 10-ton proboscideans. The terrifying roar of the short-faced bear faded from the landscape. The continent became a quieter, emptier, less wondrous place. For decades, scientists have been sifting through the dust of this lost world, trying to solve what is essentially the coldest of cold cases. What killed the megafauna? And like any good mystery, there are several prime suspects. Our first suspect is, perhaps the most obvious one, it's us, human beings. This is a theory known politely as the overkill hypothesis, or more dramatically as the blitzkrieg model, and it paints a rather stark picture of our ancestors. The idea was most famously championed by a scientist named Paul S. Martin, and it's brutally simple. The timeline, he pointed out, is almost perfect. For millions of years, these giant animals thrived in North America without any major problems. Then a new, two-legged, disturbingly clever predator shows up, carrying lethally effective projectile weapons, and within 1,000 years or so, a mere heartbeat in geological time, the giants are gone. Coincidence? Paul Martin thought not. The argument is compelling, because it's a story we've seen play out elsewhere. Humans are the planet's ultimate invasive species. When we arrive somewhere new, things tend to change, and often not for the better if you happen to be large, slow to reproduce, and tasty. The megafauna of North America had evolved in a world without people. They had defenses against saber-toothed cats and giant bears, but they had no instinctual fear, no evolutionary programming to deal with a creature that could kill from a distance. A mammoth could fend off a pride of American lions, but it had no answer for a well-thrown spear tipped with a razor-sharp Clovis point. To these animals, a human might have looked no more threatening than a deer, right up until the moment it was far, far too late. They were, in the tragic language of ecology, naive. You can picture the scene. A band of Clovis hunters, moving through a valley. They see a herd of Jefferson's ground sloths, enormous and slow-moving. The sloths, for their part, have never seen a human. They have no reason to run. They might even be curious. For the hunters, this isn't a dangerous hunt. It's more like a trip to the world's largest, slowest supermarket. The efficiency would have been staggering. The blitzkrieg model suggests that humans spread across the continent like a wave of fire, a front of highly effective exterminators, wiping out species as they went. It's a grim picture, casting our pioneering heroes as the authors of an ecological catastrophe. And there is evidence. We have found Clovis points embedded in the bones of mammoths. We have found butchering sites. The connection between the hunters and the hunted is undeniable. But is it really that simple? Can we lay the blame for the extinction of dozens of species across an entire continent at the feet of a few thousand small, nomadic bands of people? When you start to dig a little deeper, the overkill hypothesis starts to look a little thin. For one thing, if humans were such ruthlessly efficient megafauna slayers, you'd expect to find kill sites everywhere. You'd expect the archaeological record to be littered with the remains of slaughtered mammoths, mastodons, and giant sloths, but we don't. Mammoth kill sites are actually quite rare. Sites for other extinct creatures are almost non-existent. We have far more evidence of people hunting bison and caribou than we do of them hunting the creatures that vanished. And the theory doesn't explain some of the other disappearances. Why did the native North American horses and camels go extinct? These were fast, agile animals, not slow, lumbering targets. And what about the predators? The short-faced bear and the American lion didn't vanish because humans were hunting them for food. They vanished because their food source vanished. Their extinction was a ripple effect. The whole ecological house of cards came tumbling down. To blame it all on a few spear points seems to be giving our ancestors a little too much credit, or perhaps too much blame. It feels like we're missing a larger piece of the puzzle. It feels like there must have been another culprit, a force far more powerful and indiscriminate than any human hunter. And so we turn to our second suspect, a character that has been lurking in the background of our entire story so far: the climate. This is the climate change hypothesis, and it argues that the real killer wasn't human ingenuity, but the planet's own violent and unpredictable mood swings. We tend to think of the end of the Ice Age as a simple, linear process. The world was cold, and then it got warm. The glaciers were big, and then they got smaller. But the reality was anything but smooth. It was a chaotic, lurching, sputtering transition, filled with dramatic reversals, and the most dramatic of all was an event known as the Younger Dryas. It happened right around 12,000 years ago, precisely at the time the extinctions were kicking into high gear, after a period of steady warming. When the glaciers were in full retreat and the world was greening, something slammed on the brakes, hard. The planet was plunged, with shocking speed, back into near-glacial conditions. Average temperatures in North America dropped by as much as 27 degrees Fahrenheit, or 15 degrees Celsius. And this wasn't a gradual cooling over centuries. The data from ice cores in Greenland suggests this happened in the space of a decade, perhaps even just a few years. Imagine you're a woolly mammoth. You've adapted perfectly over millennia to a cold, dry world of vast, grassy plains, the mammoth steppe. You eat grass. That's your job. Your entire world is grass. Then, as the world warms, things are already getting a little uncomfortable. The spruce forests are starting to creep in, replacing your beloved grasslands. Your food supply is changing. You're having to adapt. Then, suddenly, the Younger Dryas hits. The thermostat doesn't just get turned down, it gets ripped off the wall and thrown into a freezer. The climate goes into a violent convulsion. The brand new forests die off. The old grasslands don't come back in the same way. In their place you might get soggy, boggy tundra, dominated by mosses and sedges, which are about as nutritious for a mammoth as eating cardboard. For the megafauna, this was a catastrophe on every level. Their habitats, the places they knew to find food, water and shelter, were being completely rewritten around them, year by year. It's like you wake up one morning and all the grocery stores have been replaced by hardware stores. The next day, they're all libraries. The world no longer makes sense. This kind of stress has devastating effects on animal populations. It impacts fertility rates. Infant mortality skyrockets. Herds become fragmented, isolated in shrinking pockets of suitable habitat, unable to find mates, unable to maintain genetic diversity. They become weak, vulnerable. Their entire world is pulling the rug out from under them. The beauty of the climate change hypothesis is that it accounts for the sheer scale of the event. A massive climatic shift would affect everything, everywhere, all at once. It would stress the slow-moving sloths and the fast-moving horses. It would disrupt the lives of the grazers, and in doing so sign the death warrant for the giant predators who fed on them. The ecosystem wasn't just losing a few species, the entire operating system was crashing. In this scenario, humans are not the primary cause. They are, at best, opportunistic finishers. Picture a mammoth herd already decimated by starvation, struggling to find food in a changing landscape, their numbers dwindling, and then a band of Clovis hunters shows up. For the hunters, it's a gift. For the mammoths, it's the final fatal blow. The humans weren't the storm, they were the scavengers that followed in its wake, picking off the survivors. This explanation feels more complete. It has a sense of scale that matches the tragedy. It acknowledges a force of nature far more powerful than a spear, but it still leaves a nagging question. The planet had gone through dozens of these climate cycles before. Glaciers had advanced and retreated, time and time again over the last 2 million years, and the megafauna had weathered all of those storms just fine. They had survived previous cold snaps. They had survived previous warm periods. Why was this time different? Why, at the end of this particular ice age, did they all fall off a cliff? What made the Younger Dryas so special, so uniquely deadly? This question leads us to our third suspect, and this is where the story gets a little wild. It's a theory that sounds like it was ripped from the pages of a science fiction novel. It's called the Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis, and it suggests that the climate didn't just change on its own. It was pushed by something from outer space. The theory goes like this. Around 12,000 years ago, a comet or a fragmented asteroid, perhaps several kilometers wide, entered Earth's atmosphere over North America. It didn't necessarily hit the ground in one solid piece, creating a giant crater. Instead, it may have exploded in the air, in a series of massive detonations, showering the continent below with fire and brimstone. The immediate effects would have been apocalyptic. The explosions would have generated a heat blast intense enough to ignite continent-spanning wildfires. Evidence for this comes from a strange feature in the geological record, a thin, dark layer of soil known as the black mat, which can be found at sites all across North America, and indeed around the world. It dates to precisely this time, and it's full of soot, charcoal, and other markers of widespread burning. It's like a scar left on the face of the planet. The impact and the fires would have thrown unimaginable amounts of dust, soot, and water vapor high into the atmosphere, shrouding the planet in a thick veil that blocked out the sun. This would have triggered a rapid, dramatic cooling, a kind of impact winter. Sound familiar? It's the same mechanism believed to have killed the dinosaurs. In this case, the cosmic impact could have been the trigger that kicked the planet into the Younger Dryas cold snap. It wasn't just a random climate fluctuation, it was a response to a specific violent extraterrestrial event. Scientists supporting this theory have pointed to other strange evidence found in that black mat layer. Microscopic diamonds, formed only under conditions of extreme temperature and pressure, tiny glassy spherules of melted rock, elevated levels of platinum and iridium, elements that are rare on Earth's surface but common in asteroids and comets. It all points to a single catastrophic day in the deep past. If this is true, it paints an even more terrifying picture for the megafauna. They weren't just dealing with a changing menu at the grocery store. They were dealing with the sky literally falling, with their world being set on fire, and then being plunged into a sudden deep freeze. In this scenario, the extinctions make perfect, horrifying sense. The shockwave and heat blast would have killed many animals outright. The wildfires would have destroyed their habitats on a massive scale, and the survivors would then have to contend with a sudden, brutal winter that lasted for more than 1,000 years. It's a wonder anything survived at all. This impact hypothesis is still hotly debated in the scientific community. Finding definitive proof for an event like this, so deep in the past, is incredibly difficult. The evidence can be interpreted in different ways, but it's a powerful idea because it ties the two leading suspects, humans and climate, together with a single dramatic event. The comet provides the mechanism for the sudden climate change, creating a world in which the already stressed megafauna were pushed to the absolute brink. And into this post-apocalyptic landscape walk our Clovis hunters, finding a world of weakened, traumatized and dying animals. The role of humans in this case would have been to simply deliver the coup de grace to a world that was already bleeding out. But there is one more suspect to consider, a quiet, invisible killer that may have been working in concert with all these other destructive forces. Our fourth suspect is disease. This is the hyperdisease hypothesis. Think about it. A population of humans, originally from Asia, crosses into a new continent. They bring with them not just their tools and their culture, but their entire microbiome, all the bacteria and viruses their bodies are host to. And they don't come alone. They likely have dogs with them, which carry their own set of pathogens. The animals of North America have been isolated for tens of thousands of years. They have no immunity, no biological defense against these foreign microbes. A disease that might give a human or a dog a mild cold could be a deadly plague to a mammoth or a native horse. We have seen this happen in human history, with devastating effect. When Europeans arrived in the Americas, the diseases they brought with them, like smallpox and measles, wiped out an estimated 90% of the indigenous population. It was a biological catastrophe. The hyperdisease hypothesis suggests that something similar may have happened to the animals 13,000 years ago. A devastating pandemic, or perhaps a series of them, could have swept through the megafauna populations, spreading like wildfire. This would explain the speed and the breadth of the extinctions. A deadly virus doesn't care if you're a slow sloth or a fast horse. It can infect them all. The problem with this theory is that diseases rarely leave a fossil. It's almost impossible to prove, but it makes a certain chilling sense. It's a quiet, insidious killer that would have weakened the herds, making them more vulnerable to both climate stress and human hunters. A mammoth suffering from a respiratory infection is not going to be at its best when the world freezes over or when a group of hunters appears on the horizon. So, where does that leave us? We have 4 suspects in the greatest murder mystery of the Pleistocene: the human hunter, the chaotic climate, the cosmic impact, and the invisible disease. Who is the true culprit? The reality, as is so often the case in these complex stories, is that it was probably not just one of them, it was all of them. The verdict is not a single killer, but a conspiracy. Let's try to put the pieces together into a coherent story. For thousands of years, the climate is already unstable. The great ice sheets are melting, sea levels are rising, and habitats are in flux. The giant mammals are already under a certain level of stress. This is the baseline condition, a fragile world. Then, around 12,900 years ago, a catastrophic event may have occurred, whether it was a comet from space or some other unknown trigger. The climate system is violently jolted. The planet plunges into the deep freeze of the Younger Dryas. Widespread fires may have ravaged the landscape. Ecosystems are thrown into complete chaos. The food supply for the great herbivores becomes scarce and unreliable. Their populations, already stressed, begin to crash. They are starving, they are freezing, and they are struggling to survive in a world that has become hostile and alien. And right at this moment of maximum vulnerability, 2 more killers arrive on the scene. From the south, spreading north, comes a new, incredibly intelligent and resourceful predator, Homo sapiens. They are not numerous, but they are deadly efficient, and they may be carrying invisible weapons, novel diseases against which the native fauna has no defense. It was a perfect storm, a death by 1,000 cuts. An animal might survive the climate change only to be weakened by a new disease, and then finally be brought down by a Clovis spear. A herd that managed to avoid the hunters might find its last patch of grassland wiped out by a sudden freeze. There was no single cause of death to write on the coroner's report for an entire continent's worth of animals. It was a cascade of failure, a domino effect of disasters that together proved insurmountable. And so, the giants fell. The American lions starved as the last native horses vanished. The short-faced bear, that titan of the plains, found its kingdom empty of prey. The mammoths and mastodons, the great ecosystem engineers who had shaped the landscape for millennia, shivered and starved in the Younger Dryas' cold. One by one, their thunderous footsteps faded into an unnerving silence. The world that the descendants of the Clovis people inherited was a profoundly different one from the one their ancestors had discovered. It was a continent of ghosts. The great beasts were gone, but their memory shaped the land. The very composition of the forests and grasslands changed in their absence. Without the constant grazing and browsing of millions of tons of herbivores, the landscape grew wilder, denser, different. The people had to adapt. They had conquered a new world, only to find that in the process of conquest, that world had fundamentally transformed beneath their feet. The great hunt was over. The age of the mammoth had truly, finally ended. The people who remained now looked out over a quieter, emptier plain, a plain where the future belonged not to the elephant, but to the bison. A new chapter of human existence in North America was beginning, one defined not by the pursuit of giants, but by the challenge of living in their shadows, in a world forever changed by their absence. Chapter 5. The Great Adaptation. Life after the Ice Age. And in that quiet absence, a new world was waiting to be discovered. Or perhaps more accurately, a world that had always been there, humming along in the background, was now stepping into the foreground. The deafening roar of the Ice Age megafauna had faded, and in the silence that followed, humanity began to hear the smaller, more subtle music of the landscape. The whisper of wind through cattails, the skittering of a rabbit in the underbrush, the rustle of acorns falling from an oak, the gentle splash of a fish in a quiet stream. This was the new soundtrack for survival. For generations, the entire operating system of human life in the Americas had been built around a single massive enterprise, the pursuit of giants. It was a culture of high stakes, high risk, and immense reward. The skills, the stories, the very identity of a person were tied to the mammoth, the mastodon, the giant ground sloth. To be a great hunter was to be a great hunter of great things. And now, those things were gone. Imagine a company whose entire business model is based on a single product, and one day that product simply ceases to exist. There is a moment of profound, terrifying silence, a what now, that echoes across the continent. This was the challenge facing the descendants of the Clovis people. They stood at the dawn of a new geological epoch, the Holocene, our epoch. The ice was in full retreat, the climate was stabilizing, and the world was beginning to look much more like the one we know today. But for them, it was an alien landscape, a puzzle with all the main pieces missing. The great herds that had been their walking pantries were now just bones sinking into the earth. The mental map that had guided their ancestors for centuries, a map marked with migration routes and ambush sites for megafauna, was now obsolete. It was time to draw a new one. This period, this long, quiet and incredibly formative era, is what archaeologists call the Archaic period. And if the Paleo-Indian period was a dramatic, high-octane feature film about hunting monsters, the Archaic is a slow-burn, character-driven documentary series stretching over thousands of years. It's a story, not of conquest, but of learning. Learning to listen, learning to look closer. It's the story of humanity falling back in love with the world, not for its giants, but for its infinite, intricate, and often hidden details. The first and most fundamental change was on the menu. The gourmet, single-item feast of mammoth steak was replaced by everything. This is what anthropologists call broad-spectrum foraging. It's a wonderfully academic term for a beautifully simple idea. If you can't eat the one big thing, you learn to eat all the little things. And there were a lot of little things. The diet of an archaic person would look to us like an impossibly complex-tasting menu, sourced from a pantry that was miles wide and seasons deep. Suddenly, the deer, which had always been a secondary prize, became a staple. The rabbit, once perhaps a target for a child's first hunting lesson, was now a crucial source of protein. Birds, turtles, snakes, lizards. If it moved, it was assessed for its nutritional value. The grand, coordinated spear thrusts of the mammoth hunt gave way to the patient, silent craft of the snare, the deadfall trap, the thrown rabbit stick. Hunting became less about overwhelming power and more about quiet cunning and a deep, intuitive understanding of animal behavior. You had to know not just where the deer herd was, but the specific trail it used to get to water. You had to know the exact spot a groundhog would emerge from its burrow, the precise branch a turkey would choose to roost on. It was a transition from being a shock trooper to being a master of espionage in the natural world. The water, too, became a source of incredible bounty. Rivers and lakes, once perhaps just watering holes on the way to the hunt, were now seen as larders in their own right. Fish, which had likely always been a part of the diet, were now pursued with systematic ingenuity. People developed nets woven from plant fibers, intricate weirs which are essentially giant fences built in the water to funnel fish into a trap, and hooks carved from bone and shell. They learnt the rhythms of the spawning seasons, those magical times of year when the rivers would turn silver with teeming life, a predictable and overwhelming glut of protein for the taking. And along the coasts, a whole new world opened up. The shores of the Atlantic, the Pacific, and the Gulf of Mexico became vast open-air buffets. Shellfish, oysters, clams, mussels were a revelation. They couldn't run away, they couldn't fight back. As long as you could pry them from their rock, or dig them from the sand, they were a reliable, stationary food source. For millennia, people would gather at the same spots, feasting and leaving behind mountains of shells. These shell middens, as they are called, grew over centuries, becoming monuments not of ego or worship, but of countless meals. They are quiet, humble testaments to a successful way of life, archaeological layer cakes of shells, discarded tools, and the bones of fish and sea mammals, each layer representing a season of plenty. But perhaps the biggest mental leap, the most profound shift in perspective, was the turn towards the plant kingdom. For the mammoth hunters, plants were likely seen as useful accessories, materials for spear shafts, shelter, and perhaps some medicinal uses. But as a primary source of calories, that was a new frontier. This wasn't just a matter of picking the occasional berry. This was the beginning of a systematic scientific exploration of botany. People learned to identify hundreds, if not thousands, of different plants. They created a mental encyclopedia, passed down from generation to generation, of what was edible, what was medicinal, and what was deadly poison. They learned that some plants, like the cattail, were a kind of one-stop shop. You could eat the roots, the young shoots, and even use the pollen as a kind of flour. They learned that other plants were edible only at a certain time of year, or only after a complex preparation process. The classic example is the acorn. Acorns from many species of oak are abundant and packed with fat and carbohydrates, a true superfood. There's just one problem. They are also loaded with bitter, indigestible tannins. Eating them raw would make you violently ill. So people had to invent a process. They had to gather the acorns, shell them, and then pound them into a fine meal. This meal then had to be leached, a process of repeatedly rinsing it with water, often in a sandy basin dug near a stream to wash away the tannins. Only after all this work could the flour be cooked into a mush or a simple bread. Think about the leap in abstract thought required for this. Someone, somewhere, had to look at a bitter, toxic nut and not just discard it, but imagine a multi-step process by which it could be rendered into something life-sustaining. This wasn't just gathering, it was food processing. It required patience, planning, and the ability to delay gratification. The reward wasn't immediate, like the felling of a mammoth. The reward came hours or days later, the result of communal labor and accumulated knowledge. This new, complex diet required a whole new set of tools. The elegant, fluted Clovis point, that master key for a single type of lock, was retired. In its place, a whole janitor's ring of specialized keys emerged. The toolkit of the archaic people is a testament to their adaptability. Spear points became smaller, more varied, and often regionally distinct. You'd use one type of point for a deer, another for a bison, and perhaps a smaller, more delicate one for a bird. The atlatl, or spear thrower, which had been around since the Paleo-Indian period, was refined and perfected. This deceptively simple device, a stick with a hook on the end that cradles the spear, acts as an extension of the arm, a lever that can launch a dart with incredible speed and force. In the hands of a skilled user, an atlatl could bring down a deer from 100 yards away. It was the high-powered rifle of its day, a force multiplier that allowed a single hunter to be far more effective. Archaeologists find the stone weights that were often attached to atlatls, beautifully polished and shaped stones we call banner stones. We don't know for sure if they were purely functional, adding momentum to the throw, or if they had a spiritual significance, but their careful craftsmanship tells us that this tool was central to their existence. But the real technological revolution of the archaic period wasn't a weapon, it was a food processor. It was the grinding stone, the simple, humble combination of a large flat stone, the metate, and a smaller handheld stone, the mano. With these two tools, you could pulverize all those tough seeds, nuts, and grains that were previously inedible. You could turn hard acorns into life-giving flour. You could grind dried cattail roots, wild seeds, and anything else you could gather into a storable, usable form. The grinding stone represents a fundamental shift in the relationship between humans and their food. It's a move from capturing energy to processing it, and it's a tool that requires you to stay put, at least for a little while. Manos and metats are heavy. You don't just tuck a 30-pound slab of rock into your pack and go for a hike. The presence of these tools in the archaeological record tells us that people were starting to have semi-permanent camps, places they returned to again and again. They were establishing a home base. The rhythmic, scraping sound of the mano against the metate would have been the sound of the archaic kitchen, a sound of domesticity and provision that would echo through households in the Americas for the next 10,000 years. Alongside the grinding stones came other new technologies. We see the proliferation of stone axes and adzes with a ground, polished edge instead of a flaked one. These were woodworking tools used for felling trees, hollowing out logs to make canoes, and building more substantial shelters. We see the widespread use of bone for tools, delicate needles for sewing clothes, sharp awls for punching holes in leather, and fishhooks of elegant and deadly simplicity. And we see the rise of one of the most versatile and underappreciated technologies in human history, basketry. With finely woven baskets, you could gather and transport all those small food items. With baskets coated in pitch or asphalt, you could carry water. You could even cook in them, by dropping fire-heated stones into the water-filled basket to bring it to a boil. Baskets were the lightweight, durable, all-purpose containers of their world. The Tupperware, the cooking pots and the backpacks of the archaic peoples. This explosion of new foods and new technologies was not uniform across the continent. This is perhaps the most important legacy of the Archaic period. As people settled into their local environments, they became masters of them. The one-size-fits-all lifestyle of the mammoth hunters gave way to a brilliant mosaic of distinct regional cultures, each one perfectly tailored to its surroundings. The story of the Archaic is not one story. It is 1,000 different stories, all unfolding at once. Let's travel in our minds to some of these different worlds. Let's start in the Great Basin, the vast arid expanse between the Rocky Mountains and the Sierra Nevada. This is a tough neighborhood. It's a land of scorching summers, freezing winters, and unpredictable rainfall. There are no great rivers, no dense forests. To our eyes, it can look empty, desolate. To the archaic peoples who lived there, it was a finely detailed map of resources, a landscape of subtle and life-sustaining abundance, if you knew where and when to look. This was the home of what archaeologists call the desert archaic tradition. These were the ultimate pragmatists, the masters of efficiency and resilience. Their entire existence was based on a seasonal round, a carefully planned annual migration across the landscape to be in the right place at the right time. Their life was a finely tuned dance with the seasons. In the spring, they would be down on the floors of the great Pleistocene lakes, which were now drying up into marshlands. Here they would harvest cattails and other green shoots, and hunt the waterfowl that flocked to these wetlands. As summer heated up, they would move to the mid-elevations, gathering the seeds of grasses like Indian rice grass, and perhaps hunting pronghorn antelope on the open plains. But the most important time of year was the fall. In the fall, they would ascend into the mountains, into the pinyon juniper woodlands. Here, they would harvest the pinyon pine nut. This was the desert archaic equivalent of the mammoth. The nuts are incredibly rich in fat and protein, a caloric bonanza. A good harvest could provide enough food to last through the lean winter months. The harvest was a massive communal effort. People would climb the trees to shake the cones down, or use long poles to knock them loose. The cones were then roasted in pits to open them and release the nuts. It was a race against time to gather as much as possible before the birds and rodents took their share. The nuts that weren't eaten immediately were cached, stored in grass-lined pits for the winter. Finding one of these ancient caches would be like finding a pharaoh's treasure for an archaeologist. To survive in this environment, you needed an encyclopedic knowledge of every plant, every animal, every spring, every rock shelter. You also needed a toolkit that was lightweight and portable. The desert archaic peoples were master weavers, creating intricate baskets for gathering and storage, nets for catching rabbits, and sandals woven from sagebrush bark to protect their feet from the hot, rocky ground. Caves and rock shelters were prime real estate, offering protection from the elements and a place to store their precious food reserves. In places like Danger Cave in Utah, archaeologists have found layers of human occupation stretching back over 11,000 years, a continuous record of people living this same resilient lifestyle, generation after generation. It wasn't a life of grand drama, but one of profound, quiet endurance. It was a testament to the human ability to make a home in the most challenging of places. Now, let us travel east across the Rockies and the Great Plains, into the eastern woodlands. Here we find ourselves in a completely different universe. The air is humid, the ground is soft with leaf litter, and we are surrounded by a dense, seemingly endless forest of oak, hickory, chestnut and maple. The sky is no longer a vast, oppressive dome, but a canopy of green. Water is everywhere, in the form of meandering rivers, streams and lakes. Life here for the eastern woodlands' archaic peoples was shaped by this overwhelming greenness. The forest was both a challenge and a provider. It was a challenge because it limited sightlines and made travel difficult. It was a provider because it was a three-dimensional pantry, full of resources from the forest floor to the highest branches. The white-tailed deer was the undisputed king of this domain, the primary source of meat, hide for clothing, and bone and antler for tools. Hunting deer in a dense forest required a different set of skills than hunting on the open plains. It was a game of stealth, of tracking, of ambushes from tree stands. The Itwandle was the perfect weapon for this environment, powerful enough to be effective, yet silent. But like their cousins in the desert, the woodland peoples came to rely heavily on the plant world, and in the eastern woodlands, the defining plant food was the nut. The forests produced a staggering abundance of hickory nuts, walnuts, butternuts, and acorns. The fall was a time of intense gathering, what archaeologists call the mast harvest, like the pinyon harvest in the Great Basin. This was a crucial time for stocking up for the winter. The nuts would be gathered, hulled, and often processed by crushing them and boiling them in water. The oil would rise to the top and could be skimmed off a pure, high-energy fat, while the nut meat could be made into flour. The rivers were just as important as the forests. They were highways for travel by dugout canoe, and they were teeming with fish, turtles, and massive beds of freshwater mussels, all along the major river valleys of the East. The Ohio, the Tennessee, the Mississippi. We find huge shell middens from the Archaic period, some of them covering acres and standing dozens of feet high. These were not just garbage dumps, they were centers of life. People returned to these spots year after year, century after century, to harvest the bounty of the river. The sheer size of these sites tells us that the population was growing, and that people were becoming more settled, tethered to these places of reliable abundance. And in the eastern woodlands, something truly remarkable began to happen towards the end of the Archaic period. Around 3,500 years ago, people started moving earth on a massive scale. The most famous example is a place called Poverty Point in modern-day Louisiana. Poverty Point is breathtaking in its scale and complexity. It consists of a series of 6 concentric C-shaped earthen ridges, spanning 3/4 of a mile across. In front of the ridges stands a colossal earthen mound, over 70 feet tall and 700 feet long. To build this, thousands of people would have had to move millions of cubic feet of earth, one basket load at a time. And here's the astonishing thing, these people were not farmers, they were still hunter-gatherer fishers. The conventional wisdom for a long time was that you needed agriculture to support the kind of large, organized population required for monumental construction. Poverty Point turns that idea on its head. It suggests that the environment of the lower Mississippi Valley was so incredibly rich, so bountiful with fish, game and plant foods, that people could settle down, generate a surplus, and organize themselves for massive public works projects without ever planting a single seed of corn. We don't know exactly what Poverty Point was. Was it a ceremonial center, a massive trading hub, an astronomical observatory? Probably a little of all three. The artifacts found there are as remarkable as the earthworks. We find stone tools made from materials sourced from all over the eastern half of the continent: chert from Ohio, soapstone from the Appalachians, flint from Arkansas. This was a cosmopolitan center, a place where people and ideas from hundreds of miles away came together. It's a tantalizing glimpse of a level of social and political complexity that we are only just beginning to understand, a flowering of culture that rose and fell long before the rise of the more famous mound-building cultures that would follow. It shows that the Archaic period was not just a time of quiet subsistence, it was also a time of innovation, organization, and the birth of grand collective ideas. Now, let's travel west again, all the way to the Pacific coast, from the sun-drenched shores of Southern California to the misty temperate rainforests of the Pacific Northwest. Another set of unique adaptations was taking shape. Here, the defining feature was the ocean. The Pacific was a provider of almost unimaginable wealth. Along the coast of California, the Chumash and their ancestors developed a sophisticated maritime culture. They lived in large, permanent villages, a rarity for hunter-gatherers. This was possible because the resources were so rich and concentrated. They harvested the abundant shellfish from the rocky shores, fished in the kelp beds, and hunted sea mammals like seals and sea lions. They also balanced this marine diet with terrestrial resources, especially the acorn, which was the staple carbohydrate. Their most remarkable technological achievement was the plank canoe, or tommel. Unlike a simple dugout canoe, the tommel was a complex piece of engineering, built from carefully shaped planks of redwood that were drilled and sewn together with plant fiber, then caulked with asphalt. These were large, seaworthy vessels, capable of travelling far out into the open ocean. With these boats they could hunt large sea mammals like dolphins and swordfish, and travel to the Channel Islands to trade. The tommel was more than just a boat. It was the key that unlocked the full potential of the Pacific, and its construction and ownership were controlled by a special guild, hinting at a complex, stratified society. Further north, along the coasts of what are now Oregon, Washington, British Columbia, and Alaska, the bounty of the sea reached its most dramatic expression. This was the land of the salmon. For most of the year, people lived off a diverse diet of shellfish, bottom fish like halibut, and sea mammals. But once a year, the world changed. The great salmon runs began. Millions upon millions of fish, driven by an ancient instinct, would surge from the ocean into the rivers to spawn. It was a tidal wave of protein, a predictable, annual miracle. During these runs, people from all over the region would gather at prime fishing spots, waterfalls, narrow channels to harvest the fish. They built incredibly effective weirs and traps to channel the fish, and used spears, dip nets, and hooks to pull them from the water. The sheer quantity of fish was so great that the main challenge wasn't catching them, but processing them for storage. The villages would have been filled with the sight and smell of fish being cleaned and hung on racks to be smoked and dried. A successful season meant a year's worth of food, a security that was almost unheard of in the hunter-gatherer world. This incredible abundance allowed for the development of some of the most complex hunter-gatherer societies on Earth. Like the Chumash, the peoples of the Pacific Northwest lived in large, permanent villages of substantial plank houses. They had hereditary chiefs, nobles, commoners, and slaves. They developed a rich and dramatic artistic tradition, most famously expressed in their carved wooden totem poles, masks, and boxes. They held elaborate feasts called potlatches, where powerful chiefs would display their wealth by giving away enormous quantities of food and goods. All of this, the social stratification, the monumental art, the elaborate ceremonies, was built on a foundation of smoked salmon. It demonstrates, much like Poverty Point, that agriculture is not the only path to cultural complexity. So we have these three very different worlds: the spare, pragmatic world of the desert archaic, a masterclass in resilience; the lush, productive world of the eastern woodlands, where the first great earthworks were built; and the rich maritime world of the Pacific coast, where the bounty of the sea fueled complex societies. And these are just three examples. Similar stories of adaptation were playing out all over the continent. On the Great Plains, where hunters on foot developed ingenious communal techniques like the bison jump, driving whole herds over cliffs; in the subarctic, where people followed the migratory caribou; and in the Arctic itself, where the ancestors of the Inuit and Aleut were perfecting the technologies needed to hunt sea mammals in a world of ice. The Archaic period, which spans from roughly 10,000 to 3,000 years ago, is easy to overlook. It lacks the cinematic drama of the mammoth hunt, or the grand narrative of the rise of agricultural empires. It is a long, slow, quiet period, but it is arguably the most important period in the human story of the Americas. It was during these millennia that the continent was truly settled, truly learned. It was the time when people stopped being just visitors in a new land and became natives, their cultures woven so tightly into the fabric of their local environments that it's impossible to imagine one without the other. This was the time when the deep foundational knowledge of the American landscape was encoded into stories, traditions, and technologies. The people of the Archaic period created 1,000 different ways to be human in North America. They were the first to discover the secrets of the acorn, the first to chart the rhythms of the salmon run, the first to build a canoe that could dance on the open ocean, the first to map the hidden springs of a desert mountain range. They laid the groundwork for everything that came after. The great civilizations of the Mississippians, the ancestral Puebloans, and the Aztecs were all built upon the deep knowledge and cultural traditions forged during the long, patient millennia of the Archaic. When agriculture did finally arrive in many parts of the continent, it wasn't adopted into a vacuum. It was integrated into these already rich and complex societies, another tool in an already sophisticated toolkit. As we let our minds drift back through this immense stretch of time, it's not the drama that should stick with us, but the quiet ingenuity. Picture a woman on her knees by a stream, patiently leaching acorn meal in a basket. Hear the rhythmic scrape of a mano against a metate. Smell the wood smoke and drying salmon in a coastal village. Feel the cool air of a desert rock shelter at dusk. This was a world defined not by a single heroic pursuit, but by a million small, skillful, and knowledgeable acts performed every single day. It was the great age of adaptation, the time when humanity learned to read the book of the American continent, not just its dramatic first chapter, but every line of every page. They learned to live in a world without monsters, and in doing so, they discovered the infinite richness of the small, the subtle, and the close at hand, creating a human tapestry as diverse and beautiful as the land itself. Chapter 6. Chapter 6. The Seeds of Change. The Dawn of American Agriculture. And so this human tapestry, woven with threads of incredible resilience and intimate knowledge, covered the land. Learning to read the book of the continent, as we said, was about more than just the dramatic first chapter of megafauna. It was about appreciating the fine print, the subtle footnotes, the quiet poetry written in the language of deer trails and riverbeds, of acorn harvests and salmon runs. It was about understanding that survival wasn't a single heroic act, but a million small, wise decisions. And as these people became ever more fluent in the dialects of their own particular corner of the world, some of them began to notice a secret language, one that had been whispered all along, not by the animals that ran, but by the plants that stayed. It was the language of the seed. And in learning this language, they began to contemplate a question so profound, so utterly world-altering, that it would change the human story forever. The question was simple, but the implications were infinite. What if we didn't have to go to the food? What if, with a little bit of patience and a whole lot of cleverness, we could convince the food to come to us and stay? This wasn't a single flash of brilliance. It wasn't some ancient genius sitting under a tree, having an apple fall on his head, and suddenly inventing the farm. That's not how history works. This was a slow, creeping dawn of an idea, a realization that unfolded over thousands of years, independently, in several places across these two vast continents. It was a shift in posture from chasing and gathering to tending and nurturing. It was the beginning of a conversation between humans and plants, a conversation that continues to this day every time we plant a garden or walk down the aisle of a grocery store. This is the story of how that conversation began. It's the story of the quietest and perhaps most important revolution in human history, the invention of agriculture. Let's travel first to the highlands and valleys of what we now call Mexico, thousands of years ago. Here, wandering bands of people, intimately familiar with every edible root and berry, would have also been familiar with a rather unassuming, scraggly wild grass. It's a plant called teosinte. If you were to see it today, you would walk right by it. It looks like any other tough, weedy grass growing on a dry hillside. It certainly doesn't look like a revolution. It doesn't even really look like food. The fruit of this grass, if you could call it that, was a tiny, pathetic little ear, maybe the length of your thumb, and on this ear were just a handful of kernels, maybe 5 to 12 of them. Each of these kernels was locked away in its own personal casing, a casing so hard it was like a tiny piece of stone. If you tried to bite into it, you were far more likely to break a tooth than to get any meaningful nutrition. To get at that tiny speck of starch inside, you'd have to painstakingly parch it with fire to make the casing brittle, then smash it with a rock. After all that work, you'd get a minuscule, gritty reward. It was, to put it politely, a high-effort, low-yield snack. It was the kind of food you ate when you were having a very, very bad day and all other options had been exhausted. And yet some person, or some group of people, somewhere around 9,000 years ago, looked at this profoundly disappointing grass and saw potential. They were the ultimate optimists. They possessed a vision that is almost impossible for us to comprehend. They began what would become one of the most astonishing feats of genetic engineering in the history of the world, performed not in a sterile lab with modern equipment, but in the dirt, with nothing but their hands, their eyes, and a patience that spanned generations. The process would have been glacially slow. It began with observation. As these people gathered teore, they weren't just grabbing it by the handful. They were connoisseurs of this miserable little plant. They would have noticed the subtle variations. Look at this one, someone might have thought, gesturing with a dusty hand. This plant has 7 kernels instead of 6. And this one over here, the casing on this kernel seems just a tiny bit less tooth-shattering. And here is where the genius lies. They didn't just eat those slightly better kernels, they saved them. They saved the outliers, the mutants, the ones that were just a little bit different in a good way. And the next season, perhaps near their regular campsite, they cleared a small patch of ground and pushed these special seeds into the soil. It wasn't farming, not yet. It was more like encouraging. It was a gentle suggestion made to the universe. More like this, please. And the universe slowly listened. The next generation of plants that grew from those selected seeds had a slightly higher chance of carrying those desirable traits, and from that harvest, they would once again select the best of the best. Maybe a plant that held onto its seeds a little longer, instead of shattering and scattering them to the wind the moment they were ripe. Maybe an ear that had a double row of kernels, tiny, almost imperceptible changes. Imagine this process, repeated year after year, century after century, millennium after millennium. A great multi-generational project, where the great-great-grandchildren might see a tangible improvement from the work of their distant ancestors, but no single person would have witnessed a dramatic leap. We get frustrated when a software update takes 5 minutes. These people were engaged in a biological software update that took 5,000 years. They were playing the longest possible game. Over this immense span of time, the unpromising teosinte began to transform. The rock-hard casing softened and eventually vanished, fusing into the central cob. The number of kernels grew from a dozen to hundreds. The ear itself swelled, growing from the size of a pinky finger to the robust, heavy cobs we know today. The plant itself became more dependent, more domesticated. Wild teosinte could spread its seeds on its own. Its domesticated descendant, maize or corn, cannot. Its seeds are wrapped tightly in a husk, unable to escape and plant themselves. It is a plant that is now entirely reliant on a human hand to peel back its protective layers and put its seeds back into the earth. It's not just a plant we created, it's a partner. We changed it, and in doing so, it would fundamentally change us. But maize was not a solo act. It was the star of a show that featured an entire cast of characters. As people in Mesoamerica became more settled, tending to their burgeoning corn patches, they noticed how other plants grew alongside it, and through the same slow process of observation and encouragement, they developed a system of such ecological perfection that we still marvel at it today. We call it the Three Sisters. The first sister, of course, was maize. It grew tall and straight, providing a strong stalk. The second sister was the bean. The clever ancient gardeners realized that if you planted beans at the base of the corn, the bean vines would have a natural pole to climb, reaching for the sunlight without competing for space on the ground. But the relationship was deeper than that. Beans, like all legumes, are what we call nitrogen fixers. They pull nitrogen from the air and put it back into the soil, replenishing the very nutrient that a heavy feeder like corn consumes so voraciously. They are natural fertilizers. And then came the third sister, squash, planted on the ground around the corn and beans. The large, broad leaves of the squash plants would spread out, creating a living mulch. This shaded the soil, preventing weeds from growing and keeping the ground moist by reducing evaporation. The spiny stems of the squash vines also discouraged pests and animals from getting to the corn and beans. What they created was not a field in the modern sense, with neat, sterile rows of a single crop. What they created was a small, bustling, symbiotic city of plants. Each of the three sisters helped the others thrive. The corn provided the architecture, the beans provided the nutrients, and the squash provided the protection and ground cover. Together, they provided a nearly perfect human diet. The corn delivered carbohydrates for energy, the beans offered protein and balanced out the amino acids that corn lacks, and the squash provided a wealth of vitamins and minerals. It was a system of complete genius, a self-sustaining ecosystem designed for human benefit, born from thousands of years of quiet, patient observation. This slow, deliberate transformation from foraging to farming was the engine that would eventually power the great civilizations of Mesoamerica, the Olmec, the Maya, the Aztec, their pyramids, their calendars, their art. It was all built on a foundation of maize. It all grew from a conversation that began with a scraggly, unloved grass and a few people with unimaginable patience. Now, let us leave the warm valleys of Mexico and travel south, and up, far up, into the thin, cold air of the Andes Mountains. Here, on the roof of the world, another group of people were having a similar conversation, but with a completely different set of plants, under a completely different set of rules. The challenges here were immense. The growing seasons are short, the sunlight is intense, the nights are brutally cold, and the land itself is often little more than a steep, rocky slope. Growing teosinte here would be impossible. You couldn't just create a nice flat field, you were trying to garden on the side of a cliff, at an altitude that leaves you breathless. The people here, the ancestors of the great Inca Empire, turned their attention not to what grew above the ground, but to what grew below it. They looked to the tuber. They found wild potatoes, but much like wild teosinte, these were not the fluffy, friendly spuds we know today. Wild potatoes are often small, gnarled, and incredibly bitter. More importantly, many of them are laced with toxic compounds called glycoalkaloids, a natural defense to stop animals from eating them. A wild potato could give you a terrible stomachache, or worse. So the Andean peoples began their own multi-millennial project of genetic modification. Through selective breeding, they encouraged the plants that produced larger, less bitter, and less toxic tubers. But they also developed incredibly sophisticated processing techniques to make the potatoes they had safe to eat. They learned that soaking them in water or clay could help leach out the toxins. They learned which ones were safe and which ones needed careful preparation. And they didn't just create one potato. That would be far too simple for a people living in such a complex vertical environment. Over the centuries, they cultivated an absolutely staggering variety of potatoes. We think of ourselves as having choice with our russets, our red skins, our fingerlings. The Andean farmers cultivated thousands of different types. There were potatoes specifically adapted for high, frosty altitudes, potatoes for lower, wetter valleys, potatoes that stored well, potatoes that were good for boiling, for roasting, for fermenting. They created a living library of tubers, a potato for every possible circumstance, a genetic insurance policy against the whims of a harsh environment. If one crop failed due to a specific pest or a strange weather pattern, there were 100 others with different strengths ready to take its place. And alongside the potato, they cultivated other high-altitude superstars, quinoa, the mother grain as they called it, a protein-rich seed that could thrive in the cold, thin soil, amaranth, carniwa. They built a whole agricultural system perfectly tuned to one of the most challenging environments on Earth. But perhaps their greatest innovation was not in what they grew, but in how they preserved it. They faced a constant problem. How do you store food to survive the times when nothing grows? Their answer was born from the very harshness of the climate itself. They invented freeze-drying. The process was simple and ingenious. After the harvest, they would spread the potatoes out on the ground in the high mountains. At night, the temperatures would plummet, freezing the potatoes solid. During the day, the intense Andean sun would thaw them. While they were soft, the farmers, men, women, and children, would walk over the potatoes, stomping on them with their bare feet to squeeze out the water. Then they would leave them to freeze again the next night. They would repeat this process for several days. Freeze, thaw, stomp, freeze, thaw, stomp. The result was a product called chuño, a small, incredibly light, dry potato that looks a bit like a piece of chalk, and it was a miracle. With all the water removed, chuño was almost impervious to rot. It could be stored for years, even decades. It was a lightweight, portable, and durable source of calories. It was the solution to famine. It was the food that fueled armies and work crews. It was the stored wealth of a mountain empire, a way to capture the energy of a summer harvest and lock it away for the lean, cold winter. It was survival, made tangible. And to even create the space for this agriculture, they had to physically reshape the world around them. They built vast systems of terraces, called andanias, literally carving steps into the sides of mountains. These weren't just simple retaining walls. They were sophisticated engineering projects. The walls were built of stone, and behind them the farmers would layer different materials, gravel at the bottom for drainage, then a layer of sand, and finally a top layer of rich soil that had often been carried up from the valleys below. These terraces created flat, arable land, prevented soil erosion, and even created microclimates, with the stone walls absorbing the sun's heat during the day and radiating it back out at night, protecting the crops from the deadly frost. From a distance, the mountains look like grand, sweeping staircases for the gods. They are a testament to an incredible amount of labor, cooperation, and a deep understanding of physics and ecology. They literally moved mountains to grow their potatoes. Meanwhile, thousands of miles to the north, in the temperate woodlands of eastern North America, along the Ohio and Mississippi River valleys, yet another group of people were embarking on their own agricultural journey. This was the third independent invention of farming in the Americas, and it's a story that's often overlooked overshadowed by the celebrity crops of maize and potatoes. Here, the process was perhaps more subtle. It wasn't about domesticating a single transformative plant, but about encouraging a whole suite of useful local species. Archaeologists call it the Eastern Agricultural Complex. For thousands of years before maize made its way up from Mexico, the people here were tending what you might call managed gardens or food forests. They looked around at the bounty of the woodlands and began to favor certain plants. They started with squash. The wild gourds they found were bitter and had thin flesh, useful mostly as containers or rattles. But through selection they bred new varieties with thicker, sweeter, more edible flesh. They were the first to domesticate the species that would give us our modern pumpkins, zucchinis and acorn squash. And they didn't stop there. They turned their attention to the common sunflower. Wild sunflowers are small and produce a multitude of tiny seeds. These ancient gardeners selected for plants with a single large flower head, packed with bigger, oilier seeds. They transformed it from a common wildflower into a reliable source of fat and protein. They also domesticated a plant we now think of as a weed, goosefoot, or chenopodium, a relative of quinoa, and marsh elder, another weedy-looking plant that they managed to breed to produce larger seeds. This wasn't the high-yield, single-crop agriculture of later eras. It was a more gentle, integrated system. They weren't clearing vast forests. They were enhancing them, creating enriched patches of edible plants within the existing ecosystem. They were working with the land, not imposing their will upon it. This system sustained them for millennia, allowing them to build remarkable cultures, like the Adena and Hopewell, famous for their vast and mysterious ceremonial earthworks. It was a different path, a different conversation with the plant world, but it was agriculture all the same. So we have these three great centers of innovation, three separate stories of how people learnt to cultivate the land. But the consequences of this shift, wherever it happened, were remarkably similar. The decision to stop chasing food and start growing it was perhaps the single most consequential choice humanity ever made. It fundamentally rewired our societies, our bodies, and our very way of thinking about the world. The first and most obvious change was the end of a nomadic existence. Foragers and hunters have to move. They follow the herds, they move with the seasons, they relocate when they've exhausted the resources in a particular area. Their homes are temporary, their possessions are few, because everything you own is something you have to carry. But farming chains you to the land. You have to stay near your fields to weed them, to protect them from animals, to harvest them at the right time, and you have to stay near your stored harvest to live off of it. And so, for the first time, people began to build permanent homes, houses made of mud brick or stone or timber, structures designed to last. And with a permanent home comes the very concept of home as we know it, a fixed point in the universe that is yours. Once you have a permanent home, you can start to accumulate things, heavy things, fragile things. One of the most important of these new things was pottery. For a nomadic group, a clay pot is a terrible piece of luggage. It's heavy, and it breaks easily. Baskets and leather bags are far more practical. But for a settled villager, a clay pot is a marvel of technology. You can use it to cook food directly over a fire, making tough grains and tubers more digestible and unlocking more of their nutrients. This second harvest, as some call it, the nutritional gain from cooking, was a revolution in itself. And you can use large ceramic jars to store your surplus grain, protecting it from moisture and pests. The archaeological record tells this story clearly. Wherever agriculture takes hold, pottery soon follows. It's the furniture of the new settled life. This new, more reliable food source also had a profound demographic effect. A foraging lifestyle is tough, especially for infants and young children. The food supply can be unpredictable, and a mother's mobile life makes it difficult to care for more than one dependent child at a time. But in a settled agricultural village, the food supply, while perhaps less varied, is generally more predictable. The calories are right there, stored in a pot. This led to what we call the Neolithic demographic transition. In simpler terms, a population boom. With a more stable food source, more children survived to adulthood. Families could be larger. The small mobile bands of a few dozen people began to coalesce into villages of a few hundred, and eventually towns of a few thousand. Humanity began to cluster. And with that clustering came the single most important ingredient for the development of complex civilization: food surplus. This is a concept that is almost alien to a hunter-gatherer society, where the goal is to get enough for today and maybe for tomorrow. The idea of producing vastly more food than you can immediately eat and storing it for the long term was radical. This surplus was the key that unlocked human potential, because once a society can produce more food than it needs to feed the people who are producing it, not everyone has to be a farmer. For the first time in human history, a significant number of people could be freed up to do other things. Someone could dedicate their life to becoming an expert potter. Another could focus on weaving textiles. Someone else could become a skilled builder or a tool maker. And some could specialize in matters of the spirit or of organization. Someone needed to track the seasons, to study the stars, to know the precise sacred time to plant the crops. This person becomes the first priest or astronomer. Someone needed to manage the communal surplus, to organize the building of irrigation canals or defensive walls, to mediate disputes between families who now live cheek by jowl. This person becomes the first chief or administrator. Social hierarchies began to form, based on who controlled the surplus. Society began to stratify. The relative egalitarianism of the foraging band gave way to the more complex, unequal structures of the village, the city, and the state. It was all made possible by that extra grain in the storage jar. But we should be careful not to romanticize this transition. The move to agriculture wasn't a simple, unqualified upgrade for the human condition. In many ways, it was a Faustian bargain. Early farmers likely worked much harder than their hunter-gatherer ancestors. Farming is backbreaking, repetitive labor. Their diets also became significantly less diverse. Hunter-gatherers might eat dozens, even hundreds of different types of plants and animals over the course of a year. An early farmer ate corn, and then more corn, and for a change of pace, some beans and squash. This nutritional monotony, this reliance on a few staple crops, often led to deficiencies and a general decline in health. Skeletons from early agricultural societies often show signs of being shorter and less healthy than their foraging predecessors. Living in permanent, crowded villages also created a whole new set of problems. Sanitation became an issue for the first time. Piles of waste accumulated, and with people living in close proximity to each other, and often to their domesticated animals, new diseases could emerge and spread like wildfire through the population. A single failed crop due to drought or blight could also be far more catastrophic than a bad hunting season. A forager could move to a new area. A farmer, tied to his land and his village, could only watch his fields wither and starve. And finally, agriculture introduced a concept that had been rare in the human experience before: ownership of land. When your life depends on a specific plot of earth that you and your ancestors have cleared, planted and nurtured, that land becomes immensely valuable. And when something is valuable, people will fight over it. The rise of agriculture corresponds directly with the rise of organized warfare. It created something to defend and something to covet. The shift to agriculture, then, was not just a change in diet. It was a complete rewiring of the human relationship with the world. It altered our sense of time. Life was no longer governed by the immediate present, the pursuit of the next meal. It became governed by the long, slow, cyclical calendar of the agricultural year. A time to plant, a time to wait, a time to weed, a time to harvest. It required planning, patience, and a kind of faith. A faith that the seeds you put in the dark earth would in fact sprout and grow towards the sun. It instilled a new discipline, a new foresight. Looking back across the immense gulf of time, we can see this transition as the great turning point. The people who first looked at a useless grass, or a bitter root, or a weedy flower, and saw the future were the architects of our modern world. Their patient, anonymous labor, carried out over countless generations, was the foundation upon which everything else was built. Every city, every book, every invention we cherish exists because long ago someone made the momentous decision to put a seed in the ground and wait. They were putting down roots, literally and figuratively. They were choosing a home. This profound shift from a mobile life of chasing sustenance to a settled life of cultivation was the seed from which new, more complex societies would grow. It was a quiet revolution, fought not with spears, but with digging sticks. Not for territory, in the beginning, but for a patch of fertile soil. It was the moment humanity stopped simply reading the book of the continent and began, with its own hands, to write new chapters into it. And those chapters would tell the story of the rise of villages and towns and great civilizations, all powered by the quiet, steady, and miraculous energy of a cultivated plant. Chapter 7. Chapter 7. The rise of the mound builders and first cities. And that cultivated plant, that quiet miracle of corn, gave the people of the continent something new, something they'd never truly had before in abundance. It wasn't just food, it was time, and it was certainty, the certainty that, if the rains came and the sun shone, there would be food next season. This was a profound, fundamental shift in the human experience. For millennia, the story of humanity had been one of constant motion, a life dictated by the whims of migrating herds and the ripening of wild berries. But now, with fields of maize to tend, a new anchor had been dropped. People stayed put. And when you stay in one place, you start to accumulate things. Not just pottery and better tools, but neighbours, lots of neighbours. Villages grew, then towns. And with this newfound stillness, this surplus of calories and hours in the day, a new question began to whisper through these growing communities. What do we do now? What do we do with all these hands, all this time? What do we build, now that we no longer have to spend every waking moment just trying to survive? The answer, it turned out, was written in the very soil beneath their feet. They would build with the earth itself. They would raise monuments, not of stone but of dirt, and in doing so, they would create societies more complex and grand than anything this continent had ever seen. Our story of these first great builders begins not in a bustling city, but in a place that feels impossibly ancient and mysterious. Even today, we have to travel down to the humid, bayou-laced landscape of what is now northeastern Louisiana, to a place called, with a certain modern understatement, Poverty Point. The name is, of course, a complete misnomer, a historical accident from a nearby 19th century plantation. The people who lived and built here, more than 3,000 years ago, were anything but poor. They were rich in ingenuity, in organization, and in a shared vision that is staggering to contemplate. Imagine standing there, around 1500 BC. The air is thick and wet, buzzing with insects. The Mississippi River is a vast, muddy artery of life nearby, and rising from the flat green landscape is something that simply shouldn't exist. A series of enormous, concentric, C-shaped earthen ridges, 6 of them, one inside the other, like a giant ripple frozen in the soil. The outermost ridge stretches for nearly 3/4 of a mile. It's not a wall, not for defense. It's too low, too wide, with pathways cutting through it. It seems to be a kind of grand amphitheatre, a stage for a civilization. And inside these ridges, archaeologists have found evidence of post holes, suggesting hundreds upon hundreds of dwellings were built along their crests. This wasn't just a monument, it was a planned community, a place for thousands of people to live, work, and gather. And that wasn't all. Dominating the site were several massive mounds. The largest, which today looks like a great grassy bird in flight, is over 70 feet tall and more than 700 feet long. We call it Mound A. To build something like this, with nothing but woven baskets and human muscle, is an act of coordination that borders on the unbelievable. Scholars have estimated it would have taken millions of baskets of dirt, each weighing around 50 pounds, moved one by a chain of human beings. There were no draft animals, no wheelbarrows, no bulldozers, just people. It suggests a society with leaders who could command immense loyalty and labour, a society with a powerful, unifying purpose. But what was that purpose? That's the beautiful, sleepy mystery of Poverty Point. It doesn't seem to have been a typical city. The people who built it were, by all accounts, still hunter-gatherers. They hadn't fully committed to the agricultural revolution that was transforming other parts of the world. They lived on the incredible bounty of the river valley: fish, turtles, deer, nuts, and wild plants. So why build something so permanent, so monumental? It seems Poverty Point was less of a capital city and more of a grand, seasonal meeting place, a pilgrimage site, a place where scattered groups from all over the region could come together for ceremonies, for trade, for a kind of prehistoric World's Fair. And the evidence for this is in the things they left behind. The ground at Poverty Point is littered with artifacts that came from hundreds, even thousands of miles away. Stone for tools from the Ouachita and Ozark Mountains, soapstone for bowls from the hills of Alabama and Georgia, copper from the Great Lakes region, more than 1,000 miles to the north. This wasn't a simple, isolated tribe. This was the hub of a vast and ancient network of exchange. You can almost picture it. Canoes laden with goods pulling up to the riverbank. People from distant lands walking the great earthen ridges, marveling at the scale of it all, trading stories and objects, participating in rituals whose meaning is now lost to the wind. One of the most common and curious artifacts they left are small baked clay objects, in all sorts of shapes, spheres, cylinders, bicones. For a long time, no one knew what they were. The polite term is Poverty Point Objects, or PPOs, which is a very archaeological way of saying, we have no idea, but the prevailing theory is that they were used for cooking. In a floodplain with few rocks, you couldn't do traditional stone boiling, so you'd heat these clay objects in a fire until they were glowing hot, and then drop them into a pit or a vessel filled with water and food to cook it. It's a brilliant, simple solution, a testament to a people who understood their environment and bent it to their will. But like so many of these early cultures, the story of Poverty Point ends in a quiet fade-out. After centuries of use, the great centre was abandoned. The ridges began to soften. The mounds were slowly claimed by grass and trees. It's as if the great party was over, and everyone simply went home. But the idea they pioneered, the idea of shaping the earth on a massive scale to reflect a shared cosmology and social order, that idea did not die. It would travel up the great river highways of the continent and find new life and new expression in the woodlands to the north. As we leave the humid air of Louisiana and drift north, up the Mississippi and into the Ohio River Valley, the landscape changes. The forests become denser, filled with oak, hickory, and maple. The seasons are more pronounced. Here, in this rich, temperate woodland, another culture began to take the idea of mound building and use it for a more specific, more intimate purpose. We call these people the Adena. The Adena culture, which flourished from about 800 BC to 1 AD, weren't building vast open-air amphitheatres like the ones at Poverty Point. Their focus was different. They were building for the dead. Their world was dotted with thousands of conical burial mounds, each one a monument to a specific individual or a small group. This marks a subtle but profound shift. If Poverty Point was about a community of the living, the Adena tradition was about honouring the ancestors and creating a permanent link between the living and the deceased. It's the beginning of a visible hierarchy, a society where some people were important enough in life to warrant this incredible expenditure of labour in death. This wasn't just a community project anymore. It was about honouring the first VIPs. Imagine an Adena burial. A respected leader or shaman has passed away. The tomb is prepared, often a log-lined chamber at the centre of a sacred space. The individual is laid to rest, often coated in red ochre, a pigment that symbolized life and rebirth, and they are not sent into the next world empty-handed. They are buried with objects of great beauty and symbolic power, ornaments made from that same copper that came from the Great Lakes, bracelets, rings, and breastplates that would have gleamed in the firelight, beautifully polished stone gorgets, a kind of ceremonial pendant, worn at the neck, and perhaps most famously, intricately carved stone pipes. The Adena pipes are masterpieces of prehistoric art. They were often carved into the shape of animals, but sometimes they were carved in the shape of a human. One of the most famous, the Adena pipe, depicts a man, possibly a shaman or priest, in full ceremonial regalia. He is powerful, poised, and his likeness was carved with a sensitivity and skill that reaches across 3 millennia. These weren't just tools for smoking tobacco. They were sacred objects, used in rituals to communicate with the spirit world. To be buried with one was a sign of immense spiritual authority. Once the individual was placed in the tomb with their grave goods, the work of building the mound would begin. Basketful by basketful, just like at Poverty Point, the earth would be piled up, a small mound at first. But these mounds were often used again and again. Generations later, another important person might be interred in the same mound, and another layer of earth would be added. Over centuries, these mounds grew, becoming looming, conical hills in the landscape, permanent markers of the community's sacred history and the lineage of its most important members. Today they look like gentle, grass-covered hills, but when they were new, they would have been raw earth browns, reds, and yellows, a stark, man-made monument rising out of the green forest floor. The Adena also built what are called sacred circles. These were large, circular earthworks, often with a ditch on the inside and a raised bank on the outside, which is an interesting detail. If you're building a defensive wall, you put the ditch on the outside to stop people from getting in. A ditch on the inside suggests you're trying to define a sacred space, to separate what happens inside the circle from the mundane world outside. Often a burial mound would be located right in the center of one of these circles. It was a complete ritual landscape, a place of ceremony, burial, and remembrance. While they were building these incredible monuments to the dead, the Adana people were living in small hamlets, practicing a mix of hunting, gathering, and early agriculture. They were cultivating native plants like sunflower, squash, and goosefoot. They were a settled, successful people, but their culture, like that of Poverty Point before them, didn't last forever. It didn't vanish in a great cataclysm. Instead, it seems to have slowly transformed, its traditions and ideas merging into an even larger and more spectacular cultural phenomenon. The tradition of honoring the dead with earthen monuments would continue, but it would become part of something much, much bigger, a web of connection that stretched for thousands of miles, a shared cultural language that produced some of the most impressive art and architecture in ancient North America. We call this the Hopewell tradition. To talk about the Hopewell is a little tricky, because it wasn't an empire, it wasn't a kingdom or a single tribe. There was no Hopewell capital city, no Hopewell emperor dictating orders. The best way to think of it is as a shared set of ideas, rituals, and artistic styles that connected hundreds of different, independent communities across a vast part of the continent, from the Great Lakes to the Gulf Coast, from the Appalachians to the Great Plains. Archaeologists call it the Hopewell interaction sphere, which is a wonderfully academic and sleepy term. You could think of it as a kind of prehistoric internet, a cultural and spiritual network where a powerful idea or a beautiful new art style could go viral, spreading from village to village along the ancient riverine highways. This interaction sphere, which peaked from about 100 BC to 500 AD, was fueled by trade on an unprecedented scale. It was as if the network that once centered on Poverty Point had exploded, becoming more complex, more extensive, and more vibrant. Materials moved across the continent with a purpose and efficiency that is hard to fathom. Imagine a piece of obsidian, volcanic glass, sharp enough to be used for the most delicate ceremonial blades. Its journey begins in what is now Yellowstone National Park, in the Rocky Mountains. It is quarried, carefully chipped into a manageable form, and then it begins to travel, passed from hand to hand, traded from one group to the next. It moves east, across the plains, until it reaches a village in the forests of Ohio, more than 1,500 miles from its source. There, a master craftsman, a specialist, works the stone, turning it into a beautiful, almost translucent blade, so large and delicate it could never be used for mundane tasks. It is an object of pure ritual power, and when its owner dies, it is placed with them in a burial mound. And it wasn't just obsidian. Sheets of mica, a silvery, shimmering mineral, were brought from the Carolinas. This mica was painstakingly cut into intricate, abstract shapes, serpents, bird talons, and most famously, the human hand. These cutouts are so delicate, so ethereal, they seem almost magical. They were likely sewn onto ceremonial clothing, where they would have flashed and glittered in the sun, or by the firelight, creating an aura of otherworldly power around the wearer. From the north, from around Lake Superior, came copper. The Hopewell artisans were masters of cold hammering this metal, beating it into thin sheets and shaping it into elaborate breastplates, ear spools, and headdresses. They would cut out complex designs, often depicting shamans transforming into animals or powerful spiritual beings, and from the south, from the Gulf of Mexico, came massive conch shells and whelks. These were carved into intricate cups and gorgets, their surfaces engraved with the swirling, complex symbols of the Hopewell belief system. To hold one of these objects in a village in Ohio was to hold the entire continent in your hand. It was a physical manifestation of this vast, interconnected world. But the Hopewell tradition is most famous for its monumental earthworks. which took the mound-building idea to a whole new level of scale and precision. In the river valleys of southern Ohio, they constructed enormous geometric complexes out of earth, not just circles and cones, but perfect squares, octagons, and long parallel walls that created sacred roadways. The most famous of these is the Newark Earthworks. It is a sprawling complex of geometric shapes covering more than 4 square miles. It is so large that a modern golf course was built inside one of its main features, the Great Circle and Octagon combination. The precision is what's truly mind-boggling. The sides of the Great Square at Newark are over 900 feet long and are almost perfectly aligned with the cardinal directions. The geometry is flawless, but the most incredible feature is that the entire complex appears to be a massive astronomical observatory. The main axis of the octagon and circle aligns perfectly with the northernmost rising of the moon, an event that happens only once every 18.6 years. Other alignments point to the summer and winter solstice sunrises and sunsets. This was not just a ceremonial center, it was a clock, a calendar, a university of astronomical knowledge, all written on the surface of the Earth. To build this required generations of careful observation, a deep understanding of mathematics and geometry, and the ability to mobilize and direct the labor of thousands of people. It tells us that these were not simple societies. They had specialists, priests, astronomers, engineers, who held complex, esoteric knowledge. Not all of their earthworks were geometric. A few hundred miles away lies another masterpiece, the Great Serpent Mound. It's an effigy mound, a mound built in the shape of an animal. It's a quarter-mile-long, sinuous serpent, uncoiling itself along the top of a ridge, its head appearing to swallow a large oval-shaped mound that may represent an egg or the sun. It's a graceful, powerful, and deeply mysterious work of art. It's not a burial mound. There are no graves within it. Its purpose seems purely symbolic, purely ceremonial. It too has astronomical alignments, with its head pointing towards the summer solstice sunset. To walk along its curves is to feel a connection to a cosmology, a worldview that saw the sacred in the land and the sky, and had the genius to unite them. The people who participated in this great Hopewell tradition lived in small, scattered settlements. They were farmers growing more and more maize, but still relying heavily on the bounty of the forest. Their daily lives were probably not so different from their Adena ancestors, but their spiritual and ceremonial lives were richer, more connected, and grander in scale. They would travel to the great earthwork complexes for rituals, for funerals, for festivals. They would meet people from far away, see goods from the edge of their known world, and participate in a shared system of belief that gave their lives meaning. And then, just like Poverty Point, just like the Adena, the Hopewell tradition began to fade. Around 500 AD, the construction of the great earthworks ceased. The vast trade networks began to break down. The flow of obsidian from the Rockies and shells from the Gulf slowed to a trickle, and then stopped. Why? There's no sign of a great war or invasion. The reasons seem to be internal. Some scholars suggest that the rise of the bow and arrow around this time may have destabilized old social orders. Others point to a shift towards more intensive agriculture, with maize becoming the dominant food source. This may have made communities more self-sufficient, more tied to their own fields, and less in need of the great continent-spanning networks of exchange. The religion itself may have simply lost its power, its ability to inspire people to build and trade on such a grand scale. The world changed. The Great Party was over. For several centuries after the decline of the Hopewell, the continent entered a quieter period. People lived in smaller, more localized communities. The great earthworks stood empty, slowly being reclaimed by nature. It might have seemed as though the era of grand, ambitious projects was over, but it was really just a pause, a gathering of strength. Because down along the Mississippi River, in a vast, fertile floodplain near modern-day St. Louis, a new culture was about to emerge, and it would build not just a ceremonial center, but a city, a true, bustling, sprawling metropolis, larger than any that had come before it north of Mexico. Its name was Cahokia. The Hopewell network was a brilliant tapestry of trade and belief, but it was a network of scattered towns and ceremonial centers. It wasn't a city, not yet. For that we have to travel forward in time, to the banks of the Mississippi, to a place that would become the largest, most complex metropolis north of Mexico. Around the year 1050 AD, something incredible happened in the American bottom, this wide, fertile floodplain of the Mississippi. It's what some archaeologists call a Big Bang, a sudden explosive coming together of people and ideas. In the space of a generation or two, a landscape of small villages was transformed into a massive planned city, teeming with thousands of people. This was Cahokia. At its peak, around 1100 AD, Cahokia was a powerhouse. Its population is estimated to have been between 10 and 20,000 people, with perhaps twice that many living in satellite towns and farming villages nearby. This made it larger than contemporary London. It was a sprawling urban centre covering 6 square miles, with over 120 earthen mounds of various sizes and functions. It was a place of immense power, of grand ceremony, of bustling markets and of rigid social hierarchy. Let's take a slow, quiet walk through Cahokia. At the height of its power, the first thing you would notice, the thing that would dominate your entire world, is the Great Central Mound. We call it Monk's Mound, again named for much later French monks who lived nearby. It is the largest prehistoric earthwork in the Americas. It is immense. Its base covers over 14 acres, larger than the base of the Great Pyramid of Giza. It rises in 4 great terraces to a height of 100 feet, and on its very top stood a massive building, perhaps 50 feet high itself, the residence of the paramount chief, or a great temple. This wasn't just a building, it was a statement. From the top of this mound, the ruler of Cahokia could look down on the entire city, a living god-king ruling from his man-made mountain, closer to the sun and the sky than any of his subjects. The construction of this single mound would have required an estimated 22 million cubic feet of earth, all moved by hand in baskets. It was a project that likely took centuries to complete, a multi-generational expression of cosmic and political order. At the foot of Monk's Mound stretched the Grand Plaza. This was a vast 40-acre open space, engineered to be perfectly flat. The Cahokians had scraped off the high spots and filled in the low spots, an incredible feat of landscape engineering. This was not just an empty field. This was the heart of the city, a place for public ceremonies, for rituals, for markets, and for playing a game called Chunky. Chunky involved rolling a small, polished stone disc across the plaza, and then throwing spears to see who could land their spear closest to where the stone would stop. It was likely a game with deep social and ritual significance, probably involving high-stakes gambling. You can almost hear the roar of the crowd, the thud of the spears, the sounds of a city at play, all under the watchful gaze of the great mound. Surrounding the plaza were other mounds, dozens of them. Most were platform mounds, smaller, flat-topped pyramids that served as the foundations for the homes of the elite, the lesser chiefs, the priests, the nobles. Society in Cahokia was sharply stratified. If you were important, you lived high above the floodplain, on a mound built by the common people. Your house was larger, your food was better, and you were literally closer to the gods. Other mounds were conical or ridge-top shaped, and likely served as burial mounds for important lineages, just like in the older Adena and Hopewell traditions. The entire central precinct of Cahokia was a sacred landscape, a map of their cosmos and their social structure built in 3 dimensions. To the west of the Grand Plaza, there was another curious feature, a series of large circles made of massive, evenly spaced wooden posts. We call them wood henges. The posts are long gone, but their holes remain, allowing archaeologists to reconstruct them. These circles were, in effect, a giant solar calendar. From a central observation post, a priest or astronomer could watch the sunrise throughout the year. Specific posts on the horizon would align with the sun on the winter and summer solstices, and the spring and fall equinoxes. This knowledge was power. It allowed the elite to determine the correct time for planting, for harvesting, and for the great religious festivals that structured Cahokian life. It was a way of demonstrating their special connection to the cosmos, their ability to understand and predict the movements of the heavens. A ruler who can tell you when the seasons will turn is a ruler who appears to have the favour of the gods. Sometime around the year 1175, after the city had been thriving for over a century, the Cahokians undertook another massive construction project. They built a wall, a palisade, 2 miles long, enclosing the entire central precinct with Monk's Mound and the Grand Plaza. This wasn't a decorative fence. It was a serious defensive structure, built of some 20,000 massive oak and hickory logs, plastered with clay and punctuated with watchtowers. Why build such a wall? It tells us that the world of Cahokia was not entirely peaceful. There were tensions, threats, either from outside enemies or perhaps from internal unrest. The wall separated the sacred core of the city, the home of the elite, from the commoners who lived in the sprawling neighborhoods outside. It was a physical manifestation of the social distance between the rulers and the ruled. Life inside the palisade was one of ceremony and power. Life outside was one of farming, craft production, and paying tribute to the elite. And life for the common person was a grind. They lived in small, rectangular, single-family homes made of wood poles and covered in woven mats and thatch. They tended the vast fields of maize that surrounded the city, the agricultural engine that powered the entire Cahokian enterprise. They were also skilled artisans. They made beautiful pottery, some of it highly polished and finely made. They were master flint knappers, producing incredibly sharp and efficient arrowheads and hoe blades. They worked shell, bone, and copper into jewelry and ornaments. But their lives were short. Analysis of skeletons shows that the people of Cahokia suffered from high rates of disease, malnutrition, and the physical wear and tear of hard labor. It was a powerful city, but for most of its inhabitants it was a tough place to live. The religion of Cahokia was complex and powerful. It seems to have been a part of what scholars call the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex, a belief system shared by many cultures in the region. It involved iconography of birds of prey, serpents, and a figure often called the Birdman, a warrior shaman figure who could travel between the earthly world and the spirit world. And this religion had a dark side. One of the most stunning and sobering discoveries at Cahokia was in a ridgetop mound known as Mound 72. Inside, archaeologists found the burial of a very important man, likely one of Cahokia's early leaders. He was laid on a bed of more than 20,000 marine shell beads, arranged in the shape of a falcon. He was surrounded by the graves of hundreds of other people. But these were not honored dead, they were human sacrifices. In one pit, more than 50 young women, all in their late teens or early 20s, were buried together. In another, 4 men were found with their heads and hands cut off. These were retainers, sacrificed to accompany their master into the next life. It is a chilling reminder that the power of the Cahokian elite was absolute, extending even over the life and death of their subjects. For 200 years, Cahokia was the center of its world. Its influence, its ideas and its goods spread up and down the Mississippi and its tributaries. It was a cultural, economic, and religious beacon, but it could not last. Beginning around the year 1250, the city began to decline. People started to leave. The great construction projects stopped. The neighborhoods emptied out. By 1350, Cahokia was effectively a ghost town. The great mound stood silent. The grand plaza was empty, and grass began to grow over the house floors and pathways. What happened? Why did this great city fall? Again, there is no evidence of a conquest. The city wasn't burned to the ground by an invading army. The answer seems to lie within Cahokia itself, and its relationship with its environment. The sheer concentration of people put an immense strain on local resources. To build the city, and to fuel their cooking fires, they had to cut down tens of thousands of trees, leading to massive deforestation. This caused erosion and localized flooding, which may have damaged their precious cornfields in the floodplain. The dense population living in close quarters would have been a perfect breeding ground for disease. There may have been a period of climate change, a little ice age that made growing seasons shorter and less reliable, and there was likely social and political stress. A society built on such rigid hierarchy, with a small elite commanding the labor and tribute of a vast population, is inherently unstable. A few bad harvests, a loss of faith in the ruler's ability to please the gods, and the whole system could unravel. And so people voted with their feet. They simply left, moving away to smaller, more sustainable communities. The great Cahokian experiment was over. The continent's first great city rose like a rocket, and then slowly, quietly, faded away. When the first Europeans arrived in the area centuries later, the mounds were still there, great green hills that seemed like a part of the natural landscape. The descendants of the Cahokians, the Native American tribes of the region, told them stories of ancestors who had built them, but the true scale and complexity of what had once stood there was lost to memory. It's a quiet, humbling end to the story. The great earthworks of Poverty Point, the sacred circles of the Hopewell, the massive pyramids of Cahokia, they all stand today as silent witnesses to the ingenuity, the ambition, and the deep spiritual lives of the first civilizations of North America. They show us that the desire to build, to create order, to reach for the heavens is a fundamental part of the human story, here as everywhere else in the world. As we let these images fade, the great bird mound in Louisiana, the serpent in Ohio, the silent grass-covered plaza of Cahokia, we are left with the soft sound of the wind blowing through the tall grass that now covers these ancient places. It's a reminder that even the greatest cities, the most powerful systems, are just moments in time, eventually returning to the very earth from which they were so ambitiously raised. The continent would see other great civilizations rise, especially in Mexico and the Andes. But here, in the heartland of North America, the age of the great mounds was over, leaving behind a beautiful, sleepy mystery for us to ponder.